Your actions represent the most profound betrayal of trust this court has ever seen. You used your authority to manipulate and abuse 3 students. This court sentences you to 30 years for each count, to be served consecutively. That is a total of 90 years in prison.
On February 14, 2022, Raymie Long, a 42-year-old elementary school teacher at Desert Horizons Elementary School in Phoenix, Arizona, was arrested for the sexual abuse of 3 students over a period spanning nearly a decade. The veteran teacher, who had taught at the school for 15 years and received multiple teaching awards, had been systematically abusing children as young as 8 years old while using her position of authority to ensure their silence. Long's crimes began with inappropriate touching and gradually escalated to more serious sexual offenses, creating a pattern of abuse that would only be discovered when one brave student finally spoke up. The details of the case shocked the tight-knit community in the northern suburbs of Phoenix, where Desert Horizons Elementary had long been considered one of the district's model schools. Before we continue with this disturbing case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light that might otherwise remain hidden. The investigation revealed that Long had perfected a system for identifying and isolating vulnerable children, particularly those from troubled homes who were less likely to report abuse or be believed if they did. She strategically used after-school tutoring sessions and lunch detention as opportunities to be alone with her chosen victims, creating seemingly legitimate reasons for one-on-one time that wouldn't raise suspicions among other staff members. Her classroom, located in a secluded wing of the sprawling Desert Horizons campus, became the primary site of the abuse, though investigators would later discover that Long had also taken students to her home under the pretense of additional academic support. The isolation of these children physically, emotionally, and socially was deliberate and calculated, investigators would later conclude. As a third-grade teacher with an outwardly warm and caring demeanor, Long had cultivated an impeccable reputation among parents and administrators at Desert Horizons Elementary. Her colleagues described her as dedicated and passionate about education, often volunteering for additional duties, and serving as a mentor to newer teachers. Parents requested her class for their children, unaware of the dark reality that existed behind her classroom door. Long's public persona was that of a devoted educator and mother of 2, active in her church and community organizations, which made the revelations about her crimes all the more shocking to those who thought they knew her. This carefully constructed facade allowed her to operate without suspicion for years, even as she methodically selected and groomed her victims. The abuse followed a pattern that prosecutors would later describe as textbook predatory behavior. Long would identify vulnerable students, typically those from single-parent homes or families dealing with poverty, substance abuse, or other significant challenges. She would then offer special attention and privileges, creating a bond of trust before gradually introducing inappropriate physical contact that would escalate over time. The teacher used a combination of psychological manipulation, threats, and exploitation of her authority to ensure her victims' compliance and silence. She told her victims that no one would believe them if they spoke up, that they would be taken away from their families, or that they were somehow complicit in the abuse. These tactics proved devastatingly effective, allowing her crimes to continue undetected for years. The scorching Phoenix sun beat down relentlessly on Desert Horizons Elementary, a sprawling single-story building of sand-colored stucco that blended into the surrounding desert landscape. Inside those walls, the cool, air-conditioned corridors presented a facade of safety and normalcy that masked the systematic abuse taking place in room 118. Long's classroom was decorated with bright posters promoting kindness and respect, student artwork, and inspirational quotes about the power of education, ironic signposts of virtue that stood in stark contrast to the teacher's actions. Parents dropping their children off each morning in the circular drive never imagined they were delivering them into the hands of a predator who had carefully calculated how to exploit institutional blind spots. The school's reputation for academic excellence had made it a desirable assignment for teachers and a sought-after educational option for families throughout the metropolitan area, adding another layer of protection to Long's carefully constructed cover. The scope of Long's crimes became apparent only after Sofia Rivera, a former student now in middle school, finally disclosed the abuse to her mother after years of carrying the burden alone. The disclosure came after a school presentation on personal safety and appropriate boundaries, which triggered memories and emotions Sofia had been struggling to suppress. Initially hesitant and frightened, she eventually revealed a history of abuse that had begun when she was 8 years old and continued until she moved on to middle school 3 years later. Her detailed account would serve as the foundation for the investigation, leading detectives to identify other potential victims and ultimately building a case that exposed the full extent of Long's predatory behavior. Sofia's courage in coming forward would later be credited with preventing countless other children from suffering similar abuse. The relentless desert heat of Phoenix seemed to mirror the intensity of the community's outrage as news of Long's arrest spread through local media. Parents gathered in shocked clusters at school drop-off, trying to process the possibility that their children might have been exposed to or victimized by a teacher they had trusted. School administrators hastily organized an emergency meeting to address parents' concerns and outline the steps being taken to support students and cooperate with the ongoing investigation. The Phoenix Police Department established a dedicated hotline for the case, which quickly became inundated with calls from current and former students and their families. The sprawling metropolitan area of over 1.6 million residents suddenly felt small and vulnerable as the case dominated local conversation and residents confronted the reality that such crimes could happen in their community. Long's abuse had continued uninterrupted, despite a complaint raised by a parent 3 years before her arrest, a critical failure that would later become a central focus of both the criminal case and subsequent civil litigation. The parent, concerned about Long's unusual interest in their child and uncomfortable with the amount of time the teacher was spending alone with the student, had approached the school principal with their concerns. Those concerns were dismissed as a misunderstanding, with the principal citing Long's exemplary record and reputation as evidence that there was nothing to worry about. No formal investigation was conducted, no report was filed with Child Protective Services or law enforcement, and Long was not even questioned about the allegations. This institutional failure to act allowed Long to continue abusing children for 3 more years before Sofia Rivera's disclosure finally triggered a proper investigation. Sofia Rivera was just 8 years old when she first entered Ramey Long's 3rd-grade classroom at Desert Horizons Elementary, a bright-eyed child with a natural curiosity and love of reading that immediately caught her teacher's attention. The youngest of 3 children in a single-parent household, Sofia often arrived at school early and stayed late while her mother worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat in Phoenix's increasingly expensive housing market. Her home situation, marked by economic instability and her mother's exhaustion, created precisely the type of vulnerability that Long had learned to identify and exploit over her years of predatory behavior. By the end of her first month in Long's class, Sofia had been singled out for special attention, offered the chance to help in the classroom during lunch, and praised extensively for her academic abilities, the first steps in a grooming process that would lead to years of abuse and silence. The desert city of Phoenix, with its stark beauty and harsh extremes, formed the backdrop to Sofia's childhood, a landscape of contradictions that mirrored her experience as a victim. On the surface, her life appeared normal, She participated in class, maintained decent grades, and had a small circle of friends, showing few external signs of the trauma she was experiencing. Inside, however, she was increasingly isolated, carrying a burden that separated her from her peers and family, much like the isolated pockets of desperate poverty that exist within Phoenix's sprawling metropolitan landscape. The abuse occurred primarily after school or during lunch detention sessions that Long had engineered through minor disciplinary actions, creating legitimate-seeming reasons for Sophia to be alone with her abuser. The calculated nature of these encounters, scheduled during times when other staff were occupied or in parts of the building that were relatively isolated, reflected Long's understanding of the school's routines and security gaps. As the abuse continued and escalated over the 3 years Sophia remained at Desert Horizons, she withdrew into herself, developing coping mechanisms that allowed her to compartmentalize her experiences and continue functioning. Her academic performance began to suffer, particularly in mathematics, which Long leveraged as a reason to schedule additional after-school tutoring sessions that provided further opportunities for abuse. Sleep disturbances, nightmares, and unexplained stomach pains became regular occurrences, though they were attributed to general stress or growth issues rather than recognized as potential signs of abuse. Sophia began avoiding certain school activities and developed a fear of being alone with adults, behaviors that were noted but not connected to any specific cause by the other adults in her life. The young girl's deteriorating emotional state was masked by her developing ability to present a facade of normalcy, a skill common among childhood trauma survivors. The psychological impact of the abuse manifested in increasingly concerning ways as Sophia progressed through elementary school under Long's influence. She developed ritualistic behaviors around cleanliness, washing her hands repeatedly until they were raw, and began experiencing panic attacks that she hid from others by retreating to bathroom stalls or quiet corners of the playground. Drawings in her school notebooks became darker and more chaotic, filled with heavy black lines and disturbing imagery that should have raised red flags but were instead interpreted as a developing artistic style. Relationships with her peers became strained as Sophia found it increasingly difficult to relate to children who hadn't experienced the violation of trust and bodily autonomy that had become her daily reality. The isolation that resulted from these changes only served to further Long's control, as Sophia became increasingly dependent on her abuser for emotional validation and attention. Within the vast, sun-scorched metropolis of Phoenix, Sophia's family lived in a modest apartment complex on the city's western edge, where the urban sprawl gives way to the desert, and the mountains rise in the distance like silent witnesses. Her mother, working as a hospital aide and weekend retail clerk, was rarely home during Sophia's waking hours, relying on her older siblings and after-school programs to provide supervision and support. This arrangement, born of economic necessity rather than neglect, created gaps in oversight that Long expertly exploited, offering to keep Sophia after school for extra help or special projects that seemed like educational opportunities rather than carefully orchestrated abuse scenarios. The family's struggle to stay afloat in Phoenix's challenging economic landscape, marked by low wages and high housing costs, created precisely the type of vulnerability that Long targeted in her selection of victims. Sophia's mother, grateful for what appeared to be a dedicated teacher's interest in her daughter, never questioned the additional time Sophia spent with Long. By the time Sophia graduated from Desert Horizons Elementary and moved on to middle school, she had endured 3 years of escalating abuse that had fundamentally altered her sense of self, her understanding of trust, and her relationship with authority figures. The transition to a new school initially offered some relief, as she was no longer under Long's direct control, though the psychological effects of the abuse continued to manifest in her behavior and emotional responses. It would take another 2 years and a middle school health class presentation on bodily autonomy and abuse recognition for Sophia to begin processing what had happened to her and considering the possibility of disclosure. The presentation included information about grooming behaviors and the tactics abusers used to maintain control, information that prompted Sophia to recognize patterns in her own experience with Long. This recognition, while painful, was the first step toward breaking the silence that had protected her abuser for so long. Sophia's decision to disclose the abuse to her mother on February 14, 2022, Valentine's Day, ironically a celebration of love, came after weeks of internal struggle and mounting anxiety that occasionally manifested in physical symptoms, severe enough to keep her home from school. The disclosure itself was halting and incomplete, beginning with vague statements about feeling uncomfortable around Long, and gradually progressing to more specific revelations as her mother responded with support rather than disbelief. The conversation, which began at their kitchen table and continued late into the night, was punctuated by periods of silence and tears as Sophia struggled to find words for experiences she had never verbalized before. Her mother, initially shocked and then increasingly horrified as the full picture emerged, moved between expressions of guilt for not recognizing the signs and fierce determination to seek justice for her daughter. By morning, the decision to contact the authorities had been made, setting in motion the investigation that would ultimately expose Long's decade-long pattern of abuse. The courage required for Sophia to break her silence cannot be overstated, particularly given Long's careful reinforcement of the idea that no one would believe her if she spoke up. The teacher had systematically undermined Sophia's trust in other adults, suggesting that her mother was too busy to be bothered with problems at school, and that administrators would always take a teacher's word over that of a student. Long had also implied that any disclosure would result in Sophia being removed from her family, a particularly effective threat given the precarious financial situation of the Rivera household and Sophia's awareness of the struggles her mother faced. These tactics, combined with the shame and confusion common to child sexual abuse victims, had created a seemingly impenetrable barrier to disclosure that Sophia somehow found the strength to breach. Her bravery in doing so would not only lead to her own path toward healing, but would ultimately protect countless other children from a similar fate. When Sofia Rivera finally disclosed the abuse she had endured, she could not have anticipated the wave of consequences that would follow. Both the painful process of investigation and legal proceedings, and the eventual validation of her experience through Long's conviction. The Phoenix Police Department's Special Victims Unit, located in a nondescript government building in downtown Phoenix where the air conditioning barely kept pace with the desert heat, became a second home to Sophia and her mother in the weeks following her disclosure. Detective Ryan Cooper, a veteran investigator with kind eyes that had seen too much and a gentle manner honed through years of interviewing traumatized children, guided Sophia through multiple interviews designed to document her experience while minimizing additional trauma. The process was exhausting and often triggering, requiring Sophia to revisit memories she had worked hard to suppress and articulate experiences for which she barely had language. Throughout these interviews, she demonstrated a resilience that belied her young age, determined that her voice would finally be heard. In the harsh desert landscape of Phoenix, where appearances often mask harsh realities, Sofia Rivera had developed survival skills that served her well during the investigation and preparation for trial. Her testimony would ultimately prove crucial in securing Long's conviction, though the process of providing that testimony would require her to confront her abuser directly, a prospect that initially filled her with paralyzing fear. The preparation for this confrontation involved months of work with victim advocates, therapists, and prosecutors who helped her understand the court process and develop coping strategies for the intense emotions that would arise. Throughout this process, Sophia gradually reclaimed elements of her identity that had been suppressed during the years of abuse: her natural assertiveness, her sense of justice, and her ability to trust her own perceptions. The desert city that had witnessed her silent suffering would now bear witness to her emergence as a survivor, determined to ensure that Long could never harm another child. The investigation into Raimi Long began on February 14, 2022, when Maria Rivera walked into the Phoenix Police Department's 5th Precinct with her daughter Sophia, their faces drawn with exhaustion after a sleepless night following Sophia's disclosure. Officer Jennifer Tate, the first to speak with them, immediately recognized the gravity of the allegations and contacted the department's Special Victims Unit, leading to Detective Ryan Cooper's assignment to the case within hours. Cooper, a 15-year veteran specializing in crimes against children, approached the initial interview with Sophia with the careful, trauma-informed techniques he had developed over his career, creating a safe environment in the precinct's child-friendly interview room where the desert sun streamed through blinds, casting striped shadows across the small table where Sophia sat clutching a department-issued teddy bear. The detective's first priority was establishing rapport with the visibly terrified 12-year-old, whose voice rarely rose above a whisper as she began to share her account of abuse that had started 4 years earlier in Long's 3rd-grade classroom. The scorching Phoenix heat seemed to intensify as Detective Cooper listened to Sophia's disclosure, her halting description of how Long had used after-school tutoring and lunch detentions as opportunities to isolate and abuse her over a 3-year period. The detective's experienced eye noted the classic signs of grooming in Sophia's account. Long's selection of a child from a vulnerable home situation, the progressive boundary violations that normalized inappropriate contact, and the combination of threats and special privileges used to ensure silence. Sophia's disclosure included specific details that lent credibility to her account: the layout of Long's classroom where most of the abuse occurred, the particular times and circumstances under which Long would engineer one-on-one situations, and the progression of the abuse from inappropriate touching to more serious sexual offenses. The foundational clue that would drive the investigation forward was Sophia's detailed account of how the teacher used the school's systems and schedules to create opportunities for abuse, a pattern that could potentially be corroborated through school records and witness testimony. Detective Cooper's interview with Sophia Rivera revealed the calculated nature of Long's abuse, painting a picture of a predator who had weaponized her position as a trusted educator to access and control vulnerable children. Sophia described how Long would deliberately create situations requiring discipline through minor infractions, a forgotten homework assignment, talking during silent reading time, or not completing classwork, which would result in lunch detention served alone in the classroom under Long's supervision. The teacher also offered special help after school to struggling students, particularly those whose parents worked long hours or lacked transportation, creating legitimate-seeming reasons for one-on-one time that wouldn't raise suspicions among other staff members. Cooper recognized these as classic isolation tactics used by predators in positions of authority, designed to create private access to victims while maintaining a facade of professional concern. The detective made detailed notes of this pattern, recognizing it as a potentially crucial avenue for corroborating Sophia's account and identifying other possible victims. The vast metropolitan expanse of Phoenix, with neighborhoods sprawling across the Valley of the Sun, presented unique challenges for the investigation as Cooper began the process of building a case against Long. Desert Horizons Elementary sat in a middle-class area on the city's northern edge, where tract housing developments stretched toward the mountains and the relentless sun beat down on playground equipment too hot to touch during the school day. Cooper's first visit to the school came the day after Sophia's disclosure, his unmarked sedan pulling into the visitor parking lot just as the final bell rang, sending streams of children toward waiting buses and parents' cars. The detective presented his credentials to the front office staff, requesting a meeting with Principal Douglas Warren, who appeared visibly shaken when informed of the nature of the investigation. The principal, a gray-haired man in his late 50s who had hired Long 12 years earlier, led Cooper to his office through hallways decorated with student artwork and motivational posters, the cheerful facade of the school contrasting sharply with the darkness of the allegations the detective was there to discuss. The initial conversation between Detective Cooper and Principal Warren revealed the first institutional failure that had allowed Long's abuse to continue unchecked. When questioned about any previous complaints or concerns regarding Long's behavior with students, Warren hesitated before acknowledging that a parent had raised concerns about 3 years earlier, claiming the teacher was spending an unusual amount of one-on-one time with their child. The principal admitted that he had dismissed the complaint without formal investigation, citing Long's exemplary record and reputation, and had not documented the interaction or reported it to district officials or law enforcement as required by mandatory reporting laws. Cooper's demeanor remained professional, but his questioning intensified as he requested immediate access to Long's personnel file, class rosters for the past 10 years, discipline records showing which students had served detention with her, and attendance logs for her after-school tutoring sessions. The desert sun was setting as Cooper left the school with the first batch of records, casting long shadows across the campus that seemed symbolic of the dark secrets hidden within its walls. The investigation accelerated rapidly in the days following Sophia's disclosure, with the Phoenix Police Department assigning additional detectives from the Special Victims Unit to assist Cooper as the potential scope of Long's crimes became apparent. Detective Lisa Hernandez was tasked with reviewing the school records obtained from Desert Horizons, looking for patterns in Long's assignment of detention and selection of students for after-school tutoring that might corroborate Sophia's account and identify other potential victims. Detective Marcus Johnson began interviewing current and former Desert Horizons staff members, focusing on whether anyone had observed concerning interactions between Long and her students or noticed patterns in which children received special attention from the teacher. A forensic accountant examined Long's financial records, looking for unexplained expenses or payments that might be connected to the abuse allegations. The coordinated effort reflected the department's understanding of the seriousness of the case and the potential for multiple victims spanning Long's 15-year career at Desert Horizons. Detective Hernandez's analysis of school records quickly confirmed the pattern Sophia had described, showing that Long had consistently assigned detention to a disproportionate number of students from single-parent households or families known to be experiencing financial or personal difficulties. The records showed that certain students repeatedly served detention alone, with Long during lunch periods when most staff were occupied elsewhere, creating the private access the teacher needed for abuse. After-school tutoring logs revealed a similar pattern, with Long offering special academic help to students who matched the profile of vulnerability Sophia had described, particularly children whose parents worked late or had transportation limitations. The Phoenix afternoon blazed outside the precinct windows as Hernandez compiled a list of 27 students who fit the pattern over the past decade, prioritizing them for contact and potential interviews based on the frequency of their one-on-one time with Long and the extent to which their family situations matched the vulnerability profile the teacher appeared to target. The initial phase of the investigation also involved careful planning for how to approach Ramey Long without alerting her to the full scope of the investigation, allowing detectives to observe her reactions and collect potential evidence before she had time to destroy it. Detective Cooper decided on a strategy of progressive disclosure, beginning with a seemingly routine interview about school policies regarding detention and tutoring before gradually introducing more specific questions about her interactions with students. The interview was scheduled for February 16, 2022, at Desert Horizons Elementary after school hours, with Long being told only that detectives were conducting a review of student supervision practices following a parental complaint. Simultaneously, a search warrant was being prepared for Long's home, classroom, and digital devices, based on the evidence compiled from Sophia's testimony and the corroborating patterns identified in school records. The desert night fell over Phoenix as the detectives finalized their approach, the city lights twinkling beneath a clear, star-filled sky that gave no indication of the storm about to break over Desert Horizons Elementary. On the morning of February 16th, as temperatures in Phoenix already climbed toward 80 degrees despite the winter date, Detective Cooper met with the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office to brief prosecutors on the case and ensure all legal requirements for the investigation were being met. Assistant District Attorney Olivia Phillips, assigned to lead the prosecution if charges were filed, reviewed the evidence gathered thus far and approved the search warrant applications for Long's property. Phillips, known for her meticulous preparation and unwavering advocacy for child victims, asked pointed questions about the timeline of disclosure, the school's failure to properly investigate the previous complaint, and the potential for additional victims based on the patterns emerging from the school records. The collaboration between law enforcement and prosecutors this early in the case reflected the seriousness with which all parties viewed the allegations and their commitment to building a case that could withstand the scrutiny of trial. The meeting concluded with a coordinated plan for the next phase of the investigation, including protocols for interviewing potential victims and preserving evidence that might corroborate their accounts. The scorching Phoenix afternoon cast harsh shadows across the Desert Horizons Elementary parking lot as Detectives Cooper and Hernandez arrived for their scheduled interview with Ramey Long on February 16th. The school day had just ended, students streaming out of the building into the relentless desert sun, their backpacks bouncing as they ran toward freedom, unaware of the gravity of what was unfolding in room 118. Long was waiting when the detectives entered, her classroom meticulously organized with reading materials grouped by level, math manipulatives in labeled bins, and student work displayed on colorful bulletin boards, the perfect image of an exemplary elementary classroom that had served as the setting for years of hidden abuse. The teacher, a slender woman with shoulder-length brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, appeared confident and relaxed, offering the detectives bottled water from the mini-fridge she kept stocked for her students. Cooper noted her calm demeanor, the family photos prominently displayed on her desk showing her husband and 2 teenage children, and the wall of teaching awards and certifications that had helped establish her reputation of excellence, all elements of the carefully constructed facade that had allowed her to operate without suspicion for so long. As the sun set over the Phoenix Mountains, casting the desert landscape in deepening shades of purple and gold, the interview with Long progressed from general questions about school supervision policies to increasingly specific inquiries about her interactions with certain students. Detective Cooper observed the subtle shifts in Long's body language as the questions became more pointed. The tightening of her shoulders, the decreased eye contact, and the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her water bottle when Sofia Rivera's name was first mentioned. Long maintained that her relationship with all her students was appropriate and professional, explaining that she offered detention and tutoring as part of her commitment to helping struggling students succeed academically. Her voice remained steady as she denied any improper physical contact with students, but Cooper noted that she frequently qualified her answers with phrases like, "that I recall," and "to the best of my knowledge," creating linguistic distance from definitive denials. The foundational clue of Sophia's disclosure loomed unspoken in the room, informing every question the detectives asked, while they gathered preliminary responses from Long that could later be compared to the evidence being collected through other avenues of the investigation. As Detective Ryan Cooper left Desert Horizons Elementary, following the initial interview with Ramey Long, the setting sun cast long shadows across the school's playground, much like the shadows that were beginning to fall across Long's carefully constructed facade. The detective's experienced instincts had been triggered by subtle inconsistencies in Long's responses and the defensive posture she adopted when questioned about specific students, particularly those who fit the vulnerability profile identified in Sofia Rivera's disclosure. Cooper made detailed notes of Long's physical reactions to certain questions, the slight flush that crept up her neck when asked about after-school tutoring sessions, the way her fingers fidgeted with her wedding ring when Sofia's name was mentioned, and her overly detailed explanations of why she preferred to handle lunch detention in her classroom rather than the designated detention room. These non-verbal cues, while not evidence in themselves, reinforce Cooper's growing conviction that Sofia's account was credible and that Long's professional reputation had served as an effective shield for predatory behavior targeting vulnerable children in her care. The investigation shifted into higher gear the following morning when Judge Elena Rodriguez signed search warrants for Long's classroom, home, personal vehicle, and electronic devices, finding probable cause based on Sofia's detailed disclosure and the corroborating patterns identified in school records. The Phoenix Police Department's Technical Support Unit was brought in to handle the seizure and examination of digital evidence, recognizing the potential for finding incriminating communications or images that could strengthen the case. A female-led search team was assembled to execute the warrant at Long's suburban home in North Phoenix, where the neat terracotta-roofed houses stood in orderly rows beneath the relentless desert sun, each yard landscaped with carefully placed cacti and desert plants requiring minimal water in the arid climate. The timing was strategic. Mid-morning on a weekday, when Long would be teaching at Desert Horizons, her husband at his accounting firm, and their teenage children at the local high school, allowing investigators to search without interference, while a separate team simultaneously executed the warrant on her classroom, seizing her school computer, personal items, and specific materials mentioned in Sofia's account. The searches yielded the first physical evidence supporting Sofia's disclosure, with investigators discovering a locked cabinet in Long's classroom containing handwritten notes about specific students that went far beyond normal teacher observations. The notes, organized in individual folders with students' names, included detailed information about family situations, parents' work schedules, financial challenges, and other vulnerabilities that could be exploited to gain access and ensure silence. Sofia's folder contained observations about her mother's long work hours, her lack of transportation, and notes about the girl's need for attention and desire to please, elements that Long had apparently identified as making her an ideal target. In a hidden compartment of Long's desk drawer, investigators found several USB drives containing photographs of students that appeared to have been taken during class activities but focused inappropriately on certain children, including several of Sofia that zoomed in on her in ways that, while not explicitly sexual, demonstrated an unusual level of attention and violated normal boundaries of teacher-student photography. These discoveries provided the first tangible evidence linking Long's behavior to the predatory pattern Sofia had described, lending credibility to her account and suggesting the existence of additional victims. The desert heat seemed to intensify as Detective Cooper reviewed the evidence collected from Long's home, where the search had revealed a hidden collection of student artwork and personal items that appeared to be souvenirs or trophies, a common behavior among serial predators. The items were stored in a locked safe in Long's home office closet, concealed behind winter clothing rarely needed in Phoenix's scorching climate. Each item was carefully preserved in individual plastic bags with dates and initials, including a friendship bracelet Sophia had described making in class and later noticed missing from her desk. The methodical organization of these items suggested a long-standing pattern of behavior and an awareness of the need to conceal evidence, contradicting Long's presentation as a disorganized, warm-hearted teacher who simply wanted to help struggling students. The search team also discovered a hidden compartment in Long's bedroom containing a journal with encoded entries that the technical support unit would later determine corresponded to dates of detention sessions and after-school tutoring with specific students, suggesting a record-keeping system for tracking her abuse that spanned nearly a decade. As investigators continued to analyze the evidence collected from Long's property, Detective Lisa Hernandez focused on contacting former students identified through school records as having spent unusual amounts of one-on-one time with the teacher. The desert sun beat down relentlessly on her unmarked police vehicle as she drove through Phoenix's sprawling suburbs, conducting preliminary interviews with former Desert Horizon students and their parents. These interviews required extreme sensitivity, as Hernandez needed to gather information without leading potential victims or creating false memories, while also being alert to signs that might indicate unreported abuse. The breakthrough came 3 days into this process when Hernandez interviewed Mia Johnson, now 15 and in high school, who had served frequent lunch detentions with Long 4 years earlier. Initially hesitant and anxious, Mia eventually disclosed a pattern of abuse strikingly similar to what Sophia had described, including the progression from seemingly innocent touching to more serious sexual contact, and the same threats and manipulation tactics to ensure silence. Mia's disclosure, coming independently and without knowledge of Sophia's statement, provided crucial corroboration of the pattern of abuse and strengthened the case against Long. The relentless Phoenix Sun seemed to expose every secret as a third victim emerged during the second week of the investigation, Zoe Martinez, now 17, who had been in Long's class 7 years earlier, and had also experienced abuse during after-school tutoring sessions. Zoe's disclosure came after seeing a news report about Long's suspension pending investigation, which had triggered panic attacks and nightmares that prompted her parents to seek help. The consistency across all 3 victims' accounts was striking, with each describing how Long had targeted them based on their family situations, isolated them through detention and tutoring, gradually escalated the abuse over time, and used her position of authority to ensure their silence. All 3 victims reported Long telling them that no one would believe them if they spoke up, that they would be taken away from their families, or that they were somehow responsible for what was happening. The 3 disclosures, spanning different time periods throughout Long's teaching career at Desert Horizons, established a clear pattern of predatory behavior that had continued uninterrupted for at least a decade, suggesting the possibility of additional victims who had not yet come forward. The evidence against Raimi Long mounted as the technical support unit completed their preliminary analysis of her electronic devices, discovering encrypted folders containing inappropriate images of students and communications with colleagues that revealed her deliberate targeting of vulnerable children. Emails between Long and the school counselor showed the teacher specifically requesting information about students' home situations under the guise of providing additional support, creating a list of children from single-parent households, foster care, or families experiencing financial hardship or domestic discord. The metadata on photographs of students found on Long's devices showed she had been systematically documenting certain children for years, with timestamps that often corresponded to the detention and tutoring sessions recorded in school logs. Most damning was a password-protected digital journal recovered from a hidden folder on her personal laptop, which contained entries describing her feelings towards specific students in language that, while carefully avoiding explicit admission of physical contact, clearly expressed inappropriate attraction and fantasies involving children in her care. These digital breadcrumbs reinforced the pattern described by the victims and provided additional evidence of premeditation and calculated behavior that would be crucial for prosecution. As the case against Long solidified, the investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of the institutional failures that had allowed her to operate unchecked for so long. Detective Cooper conducted follow-up interviews with Principal Douglas Warren and other Desert Horizons administrators, focusing on the dismissed complaint from 3 years earlier and the school's policies regarding one-on-one interactions between teachers and students. The desert heat seemed particularly oppressive during these interviews, conducted in the administrative offices where windows offered views of the playground where children continued their normal activities, oblivious to the investigation unfolding. Warren admitted under persistent questioning that he had received a written complaint from the parent of a student in Long's class, expressing concern about the amount of time their daughter was spending alone with the teacher and some changes in the child's behavior. The principal had dismissed these concerns without formal investigation, citing Long's teaching awards and positive evaluations, and had not documented the interaction or reported it as required by mandatory reporting laws. This failure represented a critical missed opportunity to intervene that might have prevented the abuse of subsequent victims, including Sofia Rivera. The Phoenix Police Department's conference room buzzed with activity as the investigative team assembled all the evidence gathered against Ramey Long, the walls covered with timelines, photographs, and connections that painted a damning picture of calculated predatory behavior spanning a decade. Detective Ryan Cooper led the meeting, his normally calm demeanor intensified by the gravity of the case and the clear pattern that had emerged across multiple victims. The evidence board told the story of a teacher who had systematically identified vulnerable children, created opportunities to isolate them, and used her position of authority to facilitate abuse and ensure silence. School records showing which students had served detention with Long were cross-referenced with family information, revealing her clear preference for children from troubled homes who were less likely to report or be believed. Physical evidence recovered from her home and classroom, the hidden souvenirs, the encoded journals, the inappropriate photographs, provided tangible support for the victims' accounts. Digital evidence from her devices demonstrated her deliberate targeting of vulnerable students and inappropriate fixation on certain children in her care. As the meeting concluded, the decision was unanimous. There was more than sufficient evidence to arrest Ramey Long for multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor, with the expectation that additional charges would follow as the investigation continued and the full scope of her crimes became clear. The morning of February 25, 2022, dawned with the characteristic clarity of a Phoenix winter day, the desert air crisp and cool, before the sun would climb higher to assert its dominance over the landscape. Detective Cooper arrived at Desert Horizons Elementary just as the morning bell rang, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a representative from the school district's Human Resources Department. The detective had timed the arrest to minimize public spectacle and protect the student body from witnessing their teacher being taken into custody, arriving during the first period when Long would be in her classroom with the door closed. The small group proceeded through the school's main entrance, signed in at the front office, and continued down the long corridor to room 118, where Ramey Long was leading a reading group at a kidney-shaped table, seemingly unaware that her decade of abuse and deception was about to end. The desert sun streamed through the classroom windows, illuminating the faces of the children as they looked up in confusion at the interruption, unaware of the significance of what was unfolding before them. Cooper asked Long to step into the hallway, where he formally placed her under arrest, reading her Miranda rights as the uniformed officers placed handcuffs on her wrists, the metallic click echoing in the quiet corridor as the facade of the respected teacher finally crumbled under the weight of justice. In the weeks following Ramey Long's arrest, the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office assembled a formidable case against the former elementary school teacher, with Assistant District Attorney Olivia Phillips taking the lead on what had become one of the highest-profile child abuse cases in Phoenix's recent history. Phillips, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for thorough preparation and unwavering commitment to child victims, worked closely with Detective Cooper to organize the substantial evidence into a compelling narrative that would leave no doubt about Long's guilt. The two met regularly in Phillips's office in the county courthouse, a modern building of glass and concrete in downtown Phoenix, where the air conditioning strained to combat the desert heat that seemed to intensify as spring approached. The walls of the conference room they used were soon covered with timelines, photographs, and witness statements, a visual representation of the case they were building against a woman who had exploited her position of authority to victimize vulnerable children in her care. The foundational clue of Sofia Rivera's disclosure had led to a cascade of evidence that now threatened to bury Long under the weight of her own calculated predatory behavior. The prosecution's theory of the case crystallized around Long's deliberate targeting of vulnerable children, with Phillips developing a clear narrative of how the teacher had weaponized her position of authority to identify, isolate, and abuse her victims. School records obtained through subpoena revealed that Long had consistently requested class assignments that gave her access to younger students, particularly third grade, the year when children were old enough to be separated from parents for extended periods, but young enough to be easily manipulated and confused about appropriate boundaries. The desert sun glared through the courthouse windows as Phillips analyzed detention logs spanning Long's 15-year career at Desert Horizons, noting the disproportionate number of detentions assigned to children from single-parent homes, foster care, or families known to be experiencing financial difficulties or domestic problems. The pattern was so consistent that it could not be coincidental, and when cross-referenced with the teacher's emails to the school counselor requesting information about students' home situations, it painted a damning picture of premeditation and calculated selection of victims based on their vulnerability and reduced likelihood of disclosure. The investigation into Long's methods of isolating her chosen victims yielded particularly compelling evidence of her calculated approach to creating opportunities for abuse. Detective Cooper's thorough examination of school scheduling and supervision practices revealed that Long had deliberately volunteered for duties and committee work that kept her informed about when certain areas of the school would be less supervised or completely empty. The relentless Phoenix heat seemed to bear down on the investigation team as they mapped the school's layout, identifying the areas Long had used to isolate victims: her classroom during lunch periods when most staff were in the cafeteria or teacher's lounge, the rarely used resource room where she sometimes conducted special projects with selected students, and the reading nook in a secluded corner of the library where security cameras had a blind spot. Long had also manipulated the school's after-hours policies, obtaining permission to remain on campus late for lesson preparation on days when maintenance staff were focused on other areas of the building. These tactical decisions demonstrated a level of planning and calculation that would be crucial in establishing the predatory nature of Long's behavior and countering any defense suggestion that the allegations were the result of misunderstandings or innocent physical contact. The prosecution's case was significantly strengthened by the recovery of Long's encoded journals and digital records, which the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had been called in to analyze, given the sophisticated nature of the encryption and the potential for identifying additional victims. The journals recovered from both Long's home safe and hidden folders on her personal devices contained entries spanning nearly a decade that, once decoded, revealed a disturbing record of her inappropriate fixation on certain students and her strategic planning for creating opportunities to be alone with them. The Phoenix Sun cast harsh shadows through the blinds of the forensic laboratory where technicians worked to recover deleted files from Long's devices, eventually discovering photographs of students that, while not explicitly sexual in nature, showed a pattern of focusing on certain children in ways that crossed professional boundaries. Most damning were the teacher's notes about her victims, detailed observations about their vulnerabilities, their responses to physical contact, and the effectiveness of various tactics used to ensure their silence. These records provided a window into Long's methodical approach to abusing children in her care and established a clear timeline of escalating behavior that aligned perfectly with the accounts provided by Sofia Rivera and the other identified victims. The investigation into the institutional failures that had enabled Long's continued access to vulnerable children focused particularly on the complaint that had been dismissed 3 years before her arrest. Prosecutor Phillips obtained the original email sent by parent Jennifer Lawson to Principal Douglas Warren, expressing concern about her daughter Lily's discomfort with the amount of time Long insisted she spend in detention and tutoring sessions. The scorching Phoenix Sun seemed to highlight every word of the email as Phillips read it in her office, noting Lawson's specific mention of her daughter's sudden reluctance to attend school, complaints of stomach aches on days when she had Long's class, and the girl's statement that the teacher's hugs made her feel weird and trapped. Warren's dismissive response, also recovered through electronic discovery, suggested that Lily was simply going through a phase and that Long was one of our most decorated teachers who knows how to handle difficult students. The principal had not only failed to investigate these concerns, but had actively discouraged the parent from pursuing them further, suggesting that changing teachers mid-year would be disruptive and possibly damaging to Lily's academic progress. This documented failure to act on a clear warning sign became a crucial element in establishing the systemic negligence that had allowed Long to continue abusing children long after concerns had been raised. The prosecution's case expanded beyond Long's direct actions to include an examination of how she had manipulated school systems and policies to facilitate her abuse, with Phillips working closely with educational consultants to identify the specific vulnerabilities the teacher had exploited. The investigation revealed that Long had served on the committee that developed Desert Horizon's supervision policies, allowing her to influence procedures in ways that created the gaps she would later exploit. The relentless Desert Sun beat down on the school building as investigators documented the layout modifications Long had requested over the years. Bookshelves positioned to create secluded areas in her classroom, window blinds replaced with ones that fully blocked outside view, and a classroom door with a lock that could be engaged from the inside without a key. The teacher had also cultivated a reputation for handling difficult students, positioning herself as someone willing to take on children other teachers found challenging and requesting specifically to have certain vulnerable students placed in her class year after year. This strategic positioning had allowed her to create a situation where her unusual amount of one-on-one time with certain students was seen as dedication, rather than raising suspicion, effectively weaponizing her professional reputation to shield her predatory behavior. The psychological aspects of Long's grooming process became a central focus of the case building, with expert witnesses being consulted to help explain how the teacher had systematically manipulated her victims into compliance and silence. Dr. Rebecca Feldman, a child psychologist specializing in trauma and abuse, reviewed the evidence and victim statements, identifying the classic patterns of predatory behavior evident in Long's approach. The Phoenix afternoon sun cast long shadows as Dr. Feldman explained to the prosecution team how Long had used a combination of special attention and subtle threats to control her victims, creating a complex psychological bind where children simultaneously feared her and sought her approval. The teacher had strategically alternated between praise and criticism, special privileges and punishment, creating an unpredictable environment that kept her victims constantly off balance and dependent on her for emotional validation. Long had also exploited her knowledge of child development to target students at an age when they were beginning to develop autonomy but still highly influenced by adult authority figures, making them particularly vulnerable to manipulation. This expert analysis would be crucial in helping the jury understand the sophisticated nature of Long's grooming process and the profound psychological impact on her victims. The case against Ramey Long solidified further as financial investigators uncovered evidence of her strategic efforts to gain additional access to vulnerable children outside the school environment. Bank records reveal that Long had made regular donations to several community organizations serving disadvantaged youth, consistently volunteering for programs that gave her one-on-one access to children matching the profile of her known victims. The desert heat seemed to shimmer over the financial documents spread across Detective Cooper's desk, revealing a pattern of Long positioning herself as a mentor and advocate for children from troubled homes, while simultaneously creating opportunities for potential abuse. She had served as a volunteer tutor at a community center in one of Phoenix's lower-income neighborhoods, had been a regular chaperone for a church program serving children of incarcerated parents, and had established a summer reading program that specifically targeted students without access to stable summer care. These activities had further enhanced her reputation as a dedicated educator committed to helping disadvantaged children while simultaneously providing her with access to potential victims outside the already limited oversight of the school environment. The calculated nature of these efforts strengthened the prosecution's portrait of Long as a predator who had methodically created a public persona specifically designed to facilitate and conceal her abuse. As the case-building process continued, prosecutors faced the challenge of preparing the young victims for the difficulty of testifying about their traumatic experiences in court. Victim advocate Maria Sanchez worked closely with Sofia Rivera and the other identified victims, helping them understand the court process and develop coping strategies for managing the intense emotions that would arise when facing their abuser. The Phoenix sun cast a warm glow through the windows of the child-friendly meeting room at the prosecutor's office, where Sanchez used age-appropriate language and activities to explain concepts like cross-examination, objections, and the importance of telling the truth even when questions became confusing or uncomfortable. The victims participated in mock court sessions, practiced breathing techniques for managing anxiety, and worked with therapists to process the complex feelings of shame, fear, and guilt that Long had instilled in them. Phillips observed these sessions, noting the strength and resilience demonstrated by Sophia and the others despite the trauma they had endured, and becoming increasingly determined to ensure that Long would face the full consequences of her actions. The preparation process was as much about empowering the victims to reclaim their voices as it was about building an effective prosecution, recognizing that their healing and Long's accountability were deeply intertwined goals of the justice system. By the time the Maricopa County Grand Jury convened in late March 2022, the prosecution had assembled an overwhelming case against Ramey Long, presenting evidence that led to an indictment on 32 felony counts, including sexual conduct with a minor, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation of a minor, and child molestation. The desert spring had fully taken hold of Phoenix, temperatures climbing into the 90s as Phillips presented the grand jury with school records showing Long's pattern of targeting vulnerable students, physical evidence recovered from her home and classroom, digital evidence from her devices, and testimony from Detective Cooper summarizing the statements of the 3 identified victims. The indictment represented the culmination of the initial investigation and case-building process, though Phillips made clear that the investigation remained active as additional potential victims continued to come forward following news coverage of Long's arrest. The charges carried a potential sentence of over 100 years if convicted on all counts, reflecting the severity of Long's crimes and the devastating impact on her victims. As the indictment was returned, setting the stage for trial in the Maricopa County Superior Court, the full weight of the case against Ramey Long came into focus, a damning portrait of a predator who had exploited her position as a trusted teacher to systematically abuse the vulnerable children entrusted to her care. The moment of Ramey Long's arrest, that decisive click of handcuffs closing around her wrists in the hallway outside her classroom, marked the beginning of a new phase in the case that would reverberate throughout the Phoenix community. Detective Ryan Cooper led Long through the school corridors, her head bowed and shoulders hunched in a posture starkly different from her usual confident stride. The morning desert sun streamed through the school's entrance as they emerged into the parking lot where an unmarked police vehicle waited, engine running against the already mounting heat of the day. Students pressed their faces against classroom windows, witnessing the puzzling sight of their beloved teacher being placed in a police car, creating a wave of confusion and whispered speculation that would spread through the school community within hours. Long remained silent during the short drive to the Phoenix Police Department's downtown headquarters, her expression unreadable. Behind the curtain of hair that had fallen across her face, while Cooper observed her in the rearview mirror, noting the controlled stillness that suggested she was processing the gravity of her situation and perhaps calculating her next moves. The interrogation room at Phoenix Police Headquarters was deliberately austere, a small space with cinder block walls painted a neutral beige, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 3 chairs as the only furniture. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow that seemed to intensify as the desert afternoon heat built outside, despite the building's straining air conditioning system. Long sat with her back straight and hands folded on the table, having declined the offer of water, her earlier shock apparently replaced by a composed demeanor that Detective Cooper recognized as a defensive posture. Cooper and Detective Lisa Hernandez positioned themselves across from Long, the recording equipment capturing every nuance of what would become a nearly 6-hour interrogation. Cooper began with standard booking questions, establishing Long's identity, address, and employment, while giving her time to acclimate to the environment and building a baseline of her communication patterns. The teacher responded in a clear, measured voice, maintaining eye contact and offering no additional information beyond what was specifically requested, a controlled approach that would characterize her responses throughout much of the interrogation. As the questioning shifted to the allegations against her, Long maintained a facade of professional indignation, expressing shock and confusion about why a respected educator would be subjected to such treatment. The Phoenix afternoon sun beat relentlessly against the small, high window of the interrogation room as Cooper methodically presented the foundational evidence: Sofia Rivera's disclosure, the pattern of detention assignments targeting vulnerable students, the encoded journals recovered from Long's home. The detective noted Long's physical reactions to each piece of evidence: the slight tensing of her shoulders when Sofia's name was mentioned, the momentary flutter of her eyelids when confronted with her own handwritten notes about selecting students from troubled homes, and the whitening of her knuckles as she clasped her hands more tightly when shown photographs of the souvenirs recovered from her bedroom safe. Despite these subtle tells, Long maintained verbal denials, characterizing Sophia as a troubled student with attention-seeking behaviors and suggesting that the personal items found in her home were merely sentimental keepsakes from students she had helped through difficult times. The contrast between her physical responses and verbal denials created a palpable tension in the room, with Cooper carefully documenting each inconsistency for later reference. The interrogation strategy shifted as Detective Hernandez introduced evidence of the previous complaint that had been dismissed 3 years earlier, directly questioning Long about her relationship with Lily Lawson and the concerns raised by the girl's mother. The relentless desert sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows through the interrogation room's high window as Long's composure showed its first significant crack, a momentary widening of her eyes and involuntary intake of breath before she regained control. Her response represented a tactical shift, acknowledging that she remembered Lily as a particularly needy student who had misinterpreted normal teacher affection due to her unstable home environment. This partial admission represented an attempt to create an alternative narrative that could explain away certain behaviors while still denying any criminal intent or action. Cooper noted this shift in approach, recognizing it as a classic defense mechanism of admitting to lesser issues when confronted with evidence too strong to deny completely. The detective deliberately allowed Long to develop this narrative, knowing that these partial admissions could be compared against the more comprehensive evidence still to be presented, potentially revealing additional inconsistencies that would undermine her credibility. The psychological pressure intensified as Cooper introduced the evidence recovered from Long's electronic devices, the encrypted folders containing inappropriate images of students, the emails requesting information about children's home situations, and the digital journal entries describing her feelings toward specific students. The Phoenix evening had fallen outside, the interrogation room's artificial lighting now untempered by any natural glow from the window, creating a harsh environment that seemed to mirror the increasingly inescapable nature of the evidence being presented. Long's carefully maintained composure began to fracture more noticeably, with visible tremors in her hands and a sheen of perspiration on her forehead, despite the room's cool temperature. Her responses became more fragmented and defensive, shifting between claims that the materials had been misinterpreted, suggestions that someone else might have accessed her devices, and attempts to characterize the journal entries as creative writing exercises, rather than documentation of actual thoughts or events. Cooper observed these escalating signs of distress without comment, allowing the mounting evidence to create psychological pressure while continuing to project a calm, methodical demeanor that contrasted sharply with Long's growing agitation. The turning point in the interrogation came when Cooper presented Long with the statements from Mia Johnson and Zoe Martinez, two former students who had independently come forward with accounts of abuse strikingly similar to Sophia's, despite having no knowledge of each other's experiences or the details of the investigation. The detective carefully observed Long's reaction as he described the consistent patterns across all three victims' accounts: the selection based on family vulnerability, the isolation through detention and tutoring, the gradual escalation of inappropriate contact, and the threats used to ensure silence. Long's facade of professional indignation finally crumbled completely, replaced by visible panic as she realized the extent of the case building against her. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, her gaze darting around the room as if seeking an escape, and her previous articulate responses devolved into fragmented denials and attempts to attack the credibility of her accusers. The dramatic shift in demeanor was captured by the recording equipment and noted meticulously in Cooper's report, providing valuable evidence of consciousness of guilt that would later be presented to the jury. As the interrogation entered its fifth hour, Cooper shifted tactics again, moving from presentation of evidence to questions about Long's underlying motivations, the psychological drivers behind her targeting of vulnerable children. The detective's approach became more conversational, expressing curiosity about how a teacher with Long's credentials and reputation had come to cross such fundamental boundaries with students in her care. The night had deepened outside the Phoenix Police Headquarters, the desert air cooling rapidly as it always did after sunset, while inside the interrogation room, Long sat with shoulders slumped, the earlier facade of confidence completely abandoned. The question about motivation triggered a response that surprised both detectives, not a confession, but a rambling justification in which Long characterized herself as providing emotional support and affection to children who weren't receiving it at home. She spoke of special connections with certain students and feeling that she understood their needs in ways other adults in their lives couldn't. This narrative, while still avoiding direct admission of the sexual nature of her interactions, revealed the distorted thinking common to predators who rationalize their abuse as beneficial to their victims. Cooper recognized this as valuable insight into Long's psychology and potential testimony from expert witnesses who could explain to a jury how such cognitive distortions typically function in cases of child sexual abuse. The final phase of the interrogation focused on Long's awareness of the harm she had caused, with Cooper directly confronting her with detailed descriptions of the psychological impact on her victims as documented in their statements and assessments. The Phoenix night was at its darkest point outside, the stars bright in the clear desert sky, while inside the interrogation room, Long faced the reality of the damage her actions had inflicted on children who had trusted her. Cooper described Sophia's nightmares and panic attacks, Mia's self-harming behaviors, and Zoe's struggles with intimate relationships, all consequences of the abuse they had experienced at Long's hands. The teacher's response to this information marked the most significant revelation of the interrogation, as her expression shifted from defensive self-protection to genuine distress. Tears filled her eyes for the first time since her arrest, as she whispered, "I never meant to hurt them." A statement that, while falling short of a full confession, represented an implicit acknowledgement that harm had occurred, and that she recognized her role in causing it. This moment of apparent remorse, captured on the recording and documented in the detective's reports, would later be contrasted with expert testimony about the manipulative nature of such expressions when they serve the perpetrator's interests, rather than reflecting true empathy for victims. As the interrogation concluded in the early hours of February 26th, Long was formally processed into the Maricopa County jail system, her booking photograph capturing a disheveled woman bearing little resemblance to the poised professional who had taught third grade just hours earlier. The desert night had given way to the first hints of dawn, the eastern sky beginning to lighten over the Phoenix Mountains, as Long was led to a holding cell to await her initial court appearance. Detective Cooper completed his detailed report of the interrogation, highlighting the key moments that revealed consciousness of guilt, the partial admissions that contradicted earlier denials, and the psychological insights gained into Long's selection of victims and rationalization of her behavior. The report emphasized that while Long had not provided a full confession, the totality of her responses, both verbal and nonverbal, when confronted with the evidence, substantially strengthened the case against her. The foundation laid during this interrogation would prove crucial in the subsequent legal proceedings, providing prosecutors with valuable material to present to the jury alongside the physical evidence and victim testimony that formed the core of their case against a predator who had exploited her position of authority to victimize the vulnerable children entrusted to her care. The aftermath of Long's interrogation reverberated through the Phoenix law enforcement and legal communities as details were shared with prosecutor Olivia Phillips and her team at the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office. The morning sun rose over the desert landscape, casting long shadows across the city as Phillips reviewed the interrogation transcript and video, noting the key points that would strengthen their case at trial. Long's nonverbal reactions when confronted with evidence, her shifting explanations, and her eventual acknowledgement of harm caused to the victims provided valuable material for the prosecution's narrative. Phillips met with Detective Cooper in her office, the air conditioning struggling against the building desert heat, as they discussed the psychological insights gained during questioning and how they aligned with the expert analysis of Long's predatory behavior patterns. The interrogation had confirmed their understanding of Long's calculated targeting of vulnerable children and her exploitation of her position of authority, while also revealing the cognitive distortions she used to rationalize her actions, all elements that would be crucial in presenting a compelling case to the jury about the deliberate nature of her crimes and the absence of any mitigating circumstances that might justify leniency. During Long's initial court appearance later that day, the stark contrast between her previous public persona and her current reality became visibly apparent to everyone in the Maricopa County courtroom. The afternoon sun blazed through the high windows, casting harsh light on Long's disheveled appearance as she was led into court in an orange jail jumpsuit, her hands and feet shackled according to standard procedure for defendants facing serious charges. The teacher who had once commanded respect now kept her eyes downcast, avoiding the gaze of media representatives and members of the Desert Horizon school community who had gathered to witness the proceedings. Judge Marcus Ramirez reviewed the charges against Long, multiple counts of sexual conduct with a minor, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation of a minor, and child molestation, before addressing the matter of bail. Prosecutor Phillips argued forcefully against any possibility of release, citing the serious nature of the charges, the substantial evidence already gathered, and the potential for Long to intimidate witnesses or destroy additional evidence if released. The judge concurred, ordering Long to be held without bail until trial due to the severity of the charges and the risk she posed to the community. As Long was led from the courtroom, the reality of her situation appeared to fully register on her face, a look of stunned disbelief that her life, as she had known it, had irreversibly ended, replaced by the prospect of lengthy legal proceedings and the potential for spending the remainder of her life in prison. The trial of Ramey Long began on a sweltering Phoenix morning in September 2022, 7 months after her arrest, with the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse standing as an imposing monument of justice against the clear blue desert sky. The intense media attention had transformed the case into a flashpoint for discussions about institutional failures in protecting children, with satellite trucks lining the streets surrounding the courthouse and reporters delivering live updates against the backdrop of the judicial complex. Inside Courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was tense as potential jurors filed in for the selection process, many visibly uncomfortable with the prospect of serving on such a disturbing case involving the sexual abuse of children. Judge Victoria Henderson, a veteran jurist known for her meticulous attention to procedural detail and no-nonsense courtroom management, presided over the proceedings with a gravity that reflected the seriousness of the charges. The air conditioning struggled against the desert heat and the body heat of the packed courtroom, creating an environment of physical discomfort that seemed appropriate for the difficult subject matter about to be addressed. At the defense table, Ramey Long sat beside her attorney, Richard Collins, a prominent Phoenix defense lawyer known for taking on high-profile cases. Her appearance dramatically transformed from the confident teacher who had once commanded a classroom, her previously highlighted hair now a natural brown, her designer clothes replaced by a conservative navy blue suit, and her previously warm expression now a mask of somber attention. Jury selection proceeded methodically over 3 days, with prosecutor Olivia Phillips and defense attorney Collins engaged in the careful dance of identifying jurors who could evaluate the evidence fairly, despite the emotionally charged nature of the case. The relentless Phoenix sun beat down outside while inside the courthouse, prospective jurors were questioned about their attitudes toward the education system, experiences with teachers, preconceptions about child testimony, and ability to set aside media coverage they might have encountered. Phillips sought jurors who would be receptive to the complex psychological testimony regarding grooming behaviors and the delayed disclosure common in child sexual abuse cases, while Collins attempted to identify jurors who might be skeptical of testimony from young witnesses or open to alternative explanations for Long's behavior. The process eventually yielded a jury of 9 women and 3 men, with 2 alternates, representing a cross-section of the Phoenix metropolitan area, a diverse group that included a retired nurse, a construction manager, a university administrator, a grocery store manager, and several parents of school-aged children. Judge Henderson administered the oath to the selected jurors, emphasizing their responsibility to evaluate the evidence objectively and reminding them that the defendant was presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial officially began with opening statements on September 12, 2022, with the courtroom filled to capacity and an overflow room established for additional media and public observers. The morning desert sun streamed through the high windows of the courtroom, illuminating dust particles in the air as prosecutor Olivia Phillips approached the jury box with purposeful steps, her expression reflecting the gravity of the case she was about to present. Phillips began by directly addressing the central issue. This case is about betrayal, the fundamental betrayal of trust that occurs when someone in a position of authority over children exploits that position to satisfy their own desires at the expense of the vulnerable children in their care. She outlined how the evidence would show that Ramey Long had systematically identified, isolated, and abused at least 3 students over a period spanning nearly a decade, using her position as a respected teacher to access victims and ensure their silence. The prosecutor methodically previewed the evidence the jury would see: school records showing Long's pattern of targeting vulnerable students, physical evidence recovered from her home and classroom, digital evidence from her devices, expert testimony about grooming behaviors, and most importantly, the testimony of the victims themselves. Phillips concluded by asking the jury to listen carefully to all the evidence and to focus on the foundational clue that had broken the case open: a student's courage in finally disclosing the abuse to a parent after years of silence, leading to the discovery of a predatory pattern that had continued unchecked for far too long. Defense attorney Richard Collins presented a starkly different narrative in his opening statement, portraying Ramey Long as a dedicated educator who had gone above and beyond to help struggling students, only to have her actions misinterpreted and her reputation destroyed. The Phoenix afternoon heat seemed to intensify inside the courtroom, despite the air conditioning, as Collins paced before the jury, his voice resonating with indignation on behalf of his client. He characterized the case as a tragic misunderstanding fueled by suggestive questioning of impressionable children, media hysteria, and a rush to judgment by investigators. Collins suggested that Long's extra attention to certain students was motivated by genuine concern for their academic and emotional well-being, particularly given their challenging home situations, and that any physical contact had been appropriate and in line with normal teacher-student interactions. He attacked the reliability of the victims' memories, suggesting that their accounts had been influenced by investigators' questions and the passage of time since the alleged events. The defense attorney concluded by urging the jury to maintain skepticism about the prosecution's narrative and to remember that the burden of proof rested entirely with the state. a burden he claimed they could not possibly meet, given the lack of physical evidence directly documenting abuse and the questionable reliability of testimony from young witnesses whose memories might have been contaminated by suggestive questioning and media exposure. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Detective Ryan Cooper, who provided a comprehensive overview of the investigation that had led to Long's arrest. The desert sun cast long afternoon shadows through the courthouse windows as Cooper detailed how Sofia Rivera's disclosure had triggered an investigation that quickly uncovered a pattern of predatory behavior spanning nearly a decade. The detective described the evidence recovered during searches of Long's home, classroom, and electronic devices, the encoded journals, the hidden collection of student souvenirs, the inappropriate photographs, and the records of which students had been assigned detention or selected for after-school tutoring. Using digital displays visible to the jury and gallery, Cooper walked through timeline charts and evidence photographs, establishing the methodical nature of both Long's predatory behavior and the subsequent investigation. His testimony included detailed accounts of his interviews with all three identified victims, emphasizing the consistency in their descriptions of Long's grooming process and abuse despite having had no contact with each other. Collins cross-examined Cooper aggressively, suggesting that the detective had approached the case with a presumption of guilt and had asked leading questions that influenced the victim's statements. Cooper maintained his professional demeanor throughout, acknowledging standard investigative procedures while firmly defending the integrity of the investigation and the measures taken to avoid contaminating witness testimony. The prosecution's case continued with school personnel testifying about Long's position at Desert Horizons Elementary and the institutional failures that had allowed her behavior to continue unchecked. The Phoenix morning brought temporary relief from the heat as Principal Douglas Warren took the stand, visibly uncomfortable as Phillips questioned him about the complaint received 3 years before Long's arrest. Warren admitted under oath that parent Jennifer Lawson had expressed concerns about Long's unusual interest in her daughter Lily, and the girl's increasing reluctance to attend school, particularly on days when she had detention with the teacher. The principal confirmed that he had dismissed these concerns without formal investigation based on Long's reputation and teaching awards, and had not documented the interaction or reported it as required by mandatory reporting laws. His testimony was damaging to both Long and the school district, revealing systemic failures in child protection protocols that had allowed a predator to continue operating despite clear warning signs. Warren's cross-examination by Collins focused on Long's exemplary teaching record and the absence of any formal complaints in her personnel file. But the damage had been done. The jury had heard direct evidence of a missed opportunity to intervene that might have prevented subsequent abuse, including that of Sofia Rivera. The courtroom fell completely silent as Sofia Rivera, now 13 years old, took the witness stand on the trial's fourth day, the desert sun streaming through high windows, creating an almost ethereal glow around the young girl who had broken the silence surrounding Long's abuse. Phillips had prepared the jury for Sofia's testimony, explaining in her opening statement that they would hear directly from the young person whose courage had finally exposed the pattern of abuse, and asking them to consider the difficulty of testifying about such personal violations. Sofia appeared nervous but determined as she was sworn in, her voice initially quiet but growing stronger as she began to describe her experiences in Long's third-grade classroom. She testified about how the teacher had initially singled her out for special attention and privileges, making her feel special and valued in ways that were particularly meaningful given her challenging home situation. Sofia described the gradual progression from seemingly innocent physical contact, like hugs and pats on the shoulder, to increasingly inappropriate touching during one-on-one situations engineered through detention assignments and after-school tutoring. Her testimony included specific details about the locations where abuse occurred, the things Long would say before, during, and after inappropriate contact, and the threats and manipulation used to ensure her silence, all elements that matched the accounts provided by the other victims and corroborated the pattern described by expert witnesses. Defense attorney Collins faced the delicate task of cross-examining Sophia without appearing to attack or intimidate a child victim, a challenge made more difficult by the jury's visible emotional response to her direct testimony. The afternoon desert heat seemed to intensify the tension in the courtroom as Collins approached the witness stand with a deliberately gentle demeanor that contrasted with his aggressive questioning of adult witnesses. His cross-examination focused on potential inconsistencies in Sophia's statements over time, suggesting that details might have been influenced by investigators' questions or media coverage she had been exposed to before testifying. Collins questioned Sophia about her academic performance in Long's class, attempting to establish that detentions were legitimately assigned for incomplete work rather than as pretexts for isolation. He also explored Sophia's home situation and relationship with her mother, implying that her desire for attention might have motivated false allegations. Throughout this questioning, Sophia maintained remarkable composure, acknowledging when she couldn't remember specific details while firmly maintaining the core elements of her account. Phillips objected several times when Collins' questions became inappropriately speculative or leading, with Judge Henderson sustaining most of these objections and reminding the defense attorney to maintain appropriate boundaries with the young witness. The cross-examination ultimately seemed to strengthen rather than undermine Sophia's credibility, as her consistency on key points, despite challenging questioning, made a visible impression on the jury. The testimony of child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Feldman provided the scientific framework for understanding Long's predatory behavior patterns and the delayed disclosure common in cases of child sexual abuse. The Phoenix sun had begun its descent, casting warm golden light through the courtroom windows as Dr. Feldman explained the concept of grooming, the process by which predators identify vulnerable victims, build trust, gradually violate boundaries, and maintain control through manipulation and threats. Using clear language and occasional visual aids, she described how Long's behavior, as documented in the evidence and victim testimony, represented textbook predatory patterns. The selection of children from troubled homes who were less likely to report or be believed, the creation of legitimate-seeming reasons for one-on-one access, the gradual escalation of physical contact to normalize inappropriate touching, and the use of a combination of special privileges and subtle threats to ensure compliance and silence. Dr. Feldman also addressed the psychological reasons why children often delay disclosure of abuse, particularly when the perpetrator is in a position of authority, explaining the complex dynamics of shame, fear, confusion, and self-blame that can keep victims silent for years. This expert testimony provided crucial context for understanding both Long's methodical approach to abusing children in her care and the victims' responses to that abuse, including their delayed disclosure and the psychological impact they continued to experience. As the prosecution continued building its case, digital forensics expert James Norris testified about the evidence recovered from Long's electronic devices, providing technical analysis that supported the narrative of calculated predatory behavior. The Phoenix afternoon heat had given way to a cooler evening as Norris explained to the jury how he had recovered deleted files, decoded encrypted folders, and analyzed metadata to establish patterns in Long's digital activities related to her students. His testimony revealed how Long had maintained detailed records of certain students, including inappropriate photographs, notes about their vulnerabilities, and journal entries describing her feelings toward them in language that crossed professional boundaries. Norris explained the significance of timestamps, showing that Long had often accessed these materials immediately before or after detention sessions with the students in question, establishing a connection between her digital behavior and the physical access she engineered through the school's detention and tutoring systems. The technical nature of this testimony was balanced with clear explanations and visual demonstrations that helped the jury understand its relevance to the broader case against Long. Collins's cross-examination attempted to introduce alternative explanations for the digital evidence, suggesting that normal teacher record-keeping could have been misinterpreted or that someone else might have accessed Long's devices. But Norris's confident responses to these challenges, backed by his extensive credentials and the methodical nature of his analysis, appeared to make a strong impression on the jury. The first week of trial concluded with testimony from Jennifer Lawson, the parent who had raised concerns about Long's behavior 3 years before the teacher's arrest, providing crucial evidence of the missed opportunity to intervene that might have prevented subsequent abuse. The setting desert sun cast long shadows across the courtroom as Lawson described noticing changes in her daughter Lily's behavior during the year she was in Long's class. Increasing anxiety about school, complaints of stomach aches on days when she had detention, and reluctance to discuss what happened during the one-on-one sessions with her teacher. Lawson testified about her meeting with Principal Warren, producing copies of the email she had sent expressing specific concerns about Long's unusual interest in Lily and the amount of time the teacher insisted on spending alone with her daughter. Her voice trembled with emotion as she described how her concerns had been dismissed, with Warren suggesting that Long was an exemplary teacher who knew how to handle difficult students and that changing teachers mid-year would be disruptive to Lily's education. Lawson expressed profound guilt for not pushing harder when her concerns were dismissed, wondering how many other children might have been spared if the complaint had been properly investigated. This testimony further damaged Long's defense by establishing that concerns about her behavior had been raised years before her arrest, undermining the suggestion that the allegations were recent fabrications or the result of mass hysteria following media coverage of the case. As the court adjourned for the weekend, the prosecution had established a compelling narrative of a teacher who had systematically abused her position of authority to victimize vulnerable children in her care. The Phoenix sunset painted the desert landscape in shades of orange and purple as journalists delivered their end-of-week reports outside the courthouse, summarizing the powerful testimony from victims, experts, and witnesses that had dominated the first 5 days of trial. Inside the emptying courthouse, Prosecutor Olivia Phillips met briefly with her team to review their progress and prepare for the second week, when they would present testimony from the remaining victims and conclude their case against Raimi Long. The weight of the evidence presented thus far hung heavy in the air. The foundational clue of Sophia's courageous disclosure had indeed led to the unraveling of a pattern of predatory behavior that had continued unchecked for nearly a decade, protected by Long's carefully constructed reputation and the institutional failures that had allowed warning signs to go uninvestigated. As the desert night fell over Phoenix, the jury dispersed with the judge's admonition not to discuss the case or consume media coverage related to it, carrying with them the disturbing images and testimony they had witnessed during this first week of what had already become one of the most closely watched trials in recent Phoenix history. The second week of Raimi Long's trial began with testimony from Mia Johnson, the second victim to come forward following Sofia Rivera's disclosure. Now 15 years old, Mia approached the witness stand with visible apprehension, her shoulders tense and gaze downcast as she navigated the expectant silence of the packed courtroom. The morning desert sun streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust particles in the air as Mia was sworn in, her voice barely audible, as she promised to tell the truth. Prosecutor Olivia Phillips approached with a gentle demeanor, establishing rapport before guiding Mia through her account of being in Long's class 4 years earlier. Mia's testimony revealed a pattern strikingly similar to what Sophia had described, Long's initial targeting based on her single-parent household and financial struggles. The creation of situations requiring detention and tutoring, the progressive boundary violations that began with seemingly innocent physical contact, and the combination of special privileges and subtle threats used to ensure silence. The teenager described how Long had told her she was special and understood her in ways other adults couldn't, language that expert witnesses had identified as classic grooming tactics. Mia's testimony included specific details about the locations and circumstances of the abuse that corroborated both Sophia's account and the evidence recovered from Long's property, lending further credibility to the prosecution's narrative of calculated serial predatory behavior rather than isolated incidents or misunderstandings. The emotional impact of Mia's testimony was palpable in the courtroom as she described the long-term psychological effects of the abuse she had experienced at Long's hands. The Phoenix heat seemed to intensify the atmosphere of tension as Mia spoke of developing severe anxiety, engaging in self-harming behaviors, and struggling with trust issues that affected her ability to form healthy relationships with teachers and peers. She explained how Long had manipulated her into believing that the inappropriate contact was her fault, or something she had somehow invited, creating a burden of shame and self-blame that she had carried for years before Sophia's disclosure gave her the courage to speak up. Mia's voice grew stronger as she described the relief she felt when she realized she wasn't alone, that other students had experienced similar abuse, validating her long-held sense that what had happened was wrong despite Long's efforts to normalize it. Her testimony about how Long had exploited her vulnerability as a child from a struggling single-parent household resonated deeply with the jury, many of whom appeared visibly moved by her account. Defense attorney Collins' cross-examination was notably restrained, perhaps recognizing the risk of appearing to attack a sympathetic young witness, focusing instead on minor inconsistencies in dates and details rather than challenging the core of Mia's account. The prosecution's case gained additional strength with the testimony of Zoe Martinez, now 17, who described being abused by Long 7 years earlier, establishing the earliest documented instance in the pattern of predatory behavior that had spanned nearly a decade. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom as Zoe, composed and articulate despite the difficult subject matter, recounted how Long had singled her out for special attention during a period when her family was experiencing significant financial hardship following her father's job loss. Zoe described how Long had created opportunities to be alone with her through a combination of detention assignments, tutoring sessions, and a special reading club that often involved just the two of them meeting in a secluded corner of the library. Her testimony included specific details about how the abuse had progressed, from inappropriate touching to more serious sexual contact over the course of her third-grade year, and how Long had ensured her silence through a combination of special privileges, gifts, and warnings that no one would believe her if she spoke up. The consistency across all three victims' accounts, despite their having had no contact with each other and their abuses occurring years apart, created a devastating portrait of Long's calculated approach to identifying, isolating, and victimizing vulnerable children in her care. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic psychologist specializing in child sexual abuse cases, provided expert testimony on the specific grooming and manipulation tactics used by authority figures who sexually abuse children. The relentless Phoenix sun beat down outside while inside the air-conditioned courtroom, Dr. Vasquez methodically explained how Long's behavior, as documented in the evidence and victim testimony, aligned with established patterns of predatory conduct. Using clear, accessible language and occasional visual aids, she described the selection phase, identifying vulnerable victims, the grooming phase, building trust and gradually violating boundaries, the abuse phase, the actual sexual contact, and the maintenance phase, ensuring continued access and silence through manipulation and threats. Dr. Vasquez explained how predators in positions of authority typically exploit institutional structures and their professional reputation to create opportunities for abuse and deflect suspicion, precisely as Long had done through her manipulation of the detention and tutoring systems at Desert Horizons Elementary. The psychologist also addressed the common psychological impact on victims, helping the jury understand why children often delay disclosure and how the effects of such abuse can manifest in various behavioral and emotional issues, information that provided context for understanding the experiences described by Sophia, Mia, and Zoe in their testimony. The prosecution's case reached a pivotal moment with the testimony of Dr. James Winters, the child psychiatrist who had evaluated all three victims following their disclosures and could speak to the consistent patterns in both Long's abusive behavior and its psychological impact. The afternoon desert heat had begun to relent outside the courthouse as Dr. Winters took the stand, his gray hair and gentle demeanor lending gravitas to his testimony about the trauma experienced by Sophia, Mia, and Zoe. Using anonymized clinical notes and assessment results, he explained how all three girls had exhibited classic symptoms of sexual abuse trauma: anxiety, depression, sleep disturbances, trust issues, and age-inappropriate sexual knowledge or behavior. Dr. Winters testified that the consistency in their accounts of Long's grooming process and the specific nature of the abuse strongly suggested they were reporting actual experiences rather than influenced or imagined events, addressing a key element of the defense's strategy of suggesting the allegations might be the result of suggestion or contaminated memory. His explanation of how trauma affects memory, often leading to crystal-clear recall of certain details while other peripheral aspects may be fuzzy or inconsistent, helped contextualize the minor discrepancies in dates and specific sequences that Collins had attempted to highlight during cross-examination of the victims. The scientific foundation Dr. Winters provided for understanding both Long's predatory behavior and her victims' responses to it significantly strengthened the prosecution's case by placing the individual testimonies within a broader clinical framework of child sexual abuse. The testimony of former Desert Horizons school counselor Patricia Ramirez revealed another dimension of Long's calculated approach to identifying vulnerable victims. The Phoenix evening had settled into a cooler temperature outside, while inside the courtroom, Ramirez described how Long had frequently sought information about students' home situations under the guise of providing additional support. She testified that Long had served on the student support team, which gave her legitimate access to sensitive information about family circumstances, financial hardships, parental absences, and other vulnerabilities. Ramirez produced emails from Long specifically requesting details about certain students, many of whom matched the profile of the identified victims or appeared on the list of children who had spent unusual amounts of one-on-one time with the teacher during detention or tutoring. This testimony established how Long had systematically exploited school systems to identify potential victims, using her professional reputation and apparent concern for struggling students to gain information that would help her select children who were less likely to report abuse or be believed if they did. Collins attempted to characterize these inquiries as evidence of Long's dedication to helping disadvantaged students, but Ramirez's testimony about the pattern of which students Long specifically sought information about, and her subsequent targeting of them for detention and tutoring, painted a more sinister picture of calculated predatory behavior. One of the most dramatic moments in the trial came with the testimony of Raimi Long's former teaching assistant, Gabriela Santos, who described observing concerning interactions between Long and certain students, but feeling unable to report them due to the teacher's power and reputation. The courtroom fell completely silent as Santos described instances when she had entered Long's classroom unexpectedly and found the teacher in what appeared to be inappropriately close physical contact with students during detention or after school. Santos testified that when she questioned these interactions, Long had provided plausible explanations about consoling upset students or checking for fever, but that the frequency of these incidents and the specific students involved had created a pattern that, in retrospect, should have raised serious concerns. The teaching assistant described how Long had gradually excluded her from supervision of certain activities, particularly detention periods, with specific students, and had once explicitly told her that her assistance wasn't needed on days when certain children were scheduled for after-school tutoring. Santos expressed profound remorse for not reporting these observations, explaining that Long's status in the school and close relationship with Principal Warren had made her fear for her job if she raised concerns without definitive proof of misconduct. This testimony from someone who had worked closely with Long provided crucial corroboration of the circumstances described by the victims and demonstrated how the teacher had manipulated school structures to create opportunities for abuse while actively working to prevent oversight. The prosecution's presentation of digital evidence reached its climax with the testimony of FBI cybercrime specialist Agent Marcus Taylor, who had conducted advanced analysis of the encrypted materials recovered from Long's devices. The desert evening had turned to night outside the courthouse as Taylor explained to the jury how he had decoded Long's electronic journals using specialized software and techniques, revealing entries that documented her inappropriate fixation on certain students and her strategic planning for creating opportunities to be alone with them. Using carefully redacted excerpts displayed on screens visible to the jury and court, Taylor showed how Long had tracked which tactics were most effective for ensuring children's silence, noted which students seemed most vulnerable to manipulation, and recorded details of physical interactions that clearly crossed professional boundaries. The agent testified that the encryption methods used were sophisticated and deliberate, indicating Long's awareness that the content needed to be hidden, behavior inconsistent with innocent teacher-student interactions. Taylor also presented metadata analysis showing that Long had accessed or modified these encrypted files immediately before or after scheduled detention or tutoring sessions with specific students, establishing a clear temporal connection between her digital behavior and her physical access to victims. This technical testimony provided powerful corroboration of the predatory patterns described by the victims and expert witnesses, demonstrating the calculated, premeditated nature of Long's abuse. In a strategic move that caught the defense off guard, Prosecutor Phillips called Jennifer Adams, another teacher from Desert Horizons Elementary, who had raised concerns about Long's behavior with certain students. The morning Phoenix sun illuminated the courtroom as Adams, visibly nervous but determined, testified about observing Long's unusual interest in children from troubled homes and the disproportionate amount of time she spent alone with certain students. Adams described bringing these observations to Principal Warren's attention approximately 5 years before Long's arrest, only to be told that Long was an exemplary teacher whose teaching methods shouldn't be questioned. The witness produced contemporaneous notes she had kept documenting specific incidents that had concerned her, including observations of Long engineering reasons for certain children to miss recess or lunch with their peers in order to remain in her classroom. Adams testified that after raising her concerns, she had experienced what felt like retaliation, with Long undermining her colleagues and Warren assigning her more difficult classes in subsequent years. This testimony established that warning signs about Long's behavior had been observed and reported multiple times over the years, only to be dismissed by administrators who valued the teacher's academic results and reputation over potential child safety concerns, a systemic failure that had allowed the abuse to continue unchecked for nearly a decade. The prosecution concluded its case with powerful testimony from child advocacy expert Dr. Sarah Linden, who placed Long's behavior in the broader context of how institutional structures can enable abuse when warning signs are ignored. The afternoon desert heat had reached its peak outside, while inside the courtroom, Dr. Linden explained how predators in educational settings typically exploit their position of authority, the inherent trust given to teachers, and institutional reluctance to address potential misconduct. Using Long's case as a specific example, she identified the multiple missed opportunities for intervention, the dismissed parent complaint, the ignored teacher concerns, the unusual patterns in detention assignments that together created a perfect environment for ongoing abuse. Dr. Linden testified about research showing that when early concerns are dismissed without proper investigation, predators often become more confident and escalate their behavior, explaining how Long's abuse had progressed from inappropriate touching to more serious sexual contact over the years, documented in the victim's testimony. This final expert witness tied together the various threads of the prosecution's case, demonstrating how Long's calculated exploitation of vulnerable children had been enabled by systemic failures within the school and district, and emphasizing that the foundational clue, Sofia Rivera's courage in finally disclosing the abuse after years of silence, had been the critical breakthrough that exposed a predatory pattern that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. As prosecutor Olivia Phillips rested the state's case against Ramey Long, the atmosphere in the Maricopa County courtroom was somber and tense, the weight of the evidence presented over the past 2 weeks hanging heavily in the air. The setting desert sun cast an amber glow through the high windows as Phillips summarized the case they had presented. 3 victims with strikingly similar accounts of how Long had targeted them based on their vulnerability, isolated them through manipulation of school systems, gradually escalated inappropriate physical contact under the guise of legitimate educational activities, and ensured their silence through a combination of special privileges and subtle threats. The prosecution had supported these accounts with corroborating evidence, including school records showing Long's pattern of targeting vulnerable students, physical evidence recovered from her home and classroom, digital evidence from her devices, testimony from colleagues who had observed concerning behavior, and expert analysis placing her actions within the established patterns of predatory conduct. Phillips concluded by reminding the jury of where the case had begun, with Sofia Rivera finding the courage to break her silence after years of carrying the burden alone, leading to the discovery of a calculated pattern of abuse that had victimized multiple children over nearly a decade. As the prosecution rested, all eyes turned to the defense table, where Ramey Long sat with her attorney, her expression unreadable as she faced the overwhelming evidence of her systematic exploitation of the power and authority she had been granted over the vulnerable children in her care. The defense of Ramey Long began with a strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt by offering alternative explanations for the evidence presented by the prosecution. Richard Collins opened with a measured tone, acknowledging the gravity of the accusations while suggesting that normal teacher-student interactions had been misinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. The morning Phoenix sun cast harsh light through the courtroom windows as Collins called, character witnesses, fellow teachers, parents of former students, and church members who testified to Long's reputation as a dedicated educator committed to helping disadvantaged children. These witnesses described Long's willingness to spend extra time with struggling students, her active involvement in community programs serving at-risk youth, and her apparent devotion to her own family and children. The defense attorney used these testimonies to construct a narrative of a caring teacher whose concern for vulnerable students had been twisted into something sinister by overzealous investigators, and the suggestion of misconduct planted in impressionable young minds. However, Prosecutor Phillips's cross-examinations consistently exposed the limited perspective of these character witnesses, establishing that none had observed Long's interactions with students during detention or one-on-one tutoring sessions, precisely the circumstances under which the abuse was alleged to have occurred. The prosecution effectively demonstrated that Long's public persona, the reputation these witnesses were testifying to, had been carefully cultivated as cover for her predatory behavior, a classic pattern in cases involving authority figures who abused children in their care. The defense case continued with testimony from educational psychologist Dr. Nathan Bradley, who attempted to provide alternative explanations for the behaviors and dynamics described by the prosecution's witnesses. The desert afternoon heat seemed to intensify the tension in the courtroom, as Dr. Bradley suggested that children from troubled homes might misinterpret normal physical contact as inappropriate due to their own issues with attachment and boundaries. He proposed that the consistency across victim testimonies could be explained by contamination of their memories through suggestive questioning by investigators, exposure to media coverage, or the power of suggestion from adults concerned about potential abuse. Phillips's cross-examination was devastating, forcing Dr. Bradley to acknowledge that he had not personally evaluated any of the victims, had not reviewed the complete case files, including the forensic interview recordings, and was speaking in theoretical generalities rather than addressing the specific evidence in Long's case. The prosecutor methodically walked the witness through the multiple forms of corroborating evidence, the encoded journals, the souvenirs collected from victims, the pattern in detention assignments, the testimony from colleagues who had observed concerning interactions, asking after each item how memory contamination could explain these physical and documentary pieces of evidence. By the conclusion of his testimony, Dr. Bradley's credibility appeared significantly diminished, his theoretical alternatives seeming implausible against the mountain of specific, corroborating evidence presented by the prosecution. In a high-risk strategy, the defense called Ramey Long herself to testify, a decision that would subject her to cross-examination by Prosecutor Phillips. The courtroom fell completely silent as Long took the stand on the trial's third week, the desert sun creating a spotlight effect through the high windows as she was sworn in. Long presented a carefully constructed image of composure and dignified suffering, dressed conservatively in a navy blue suit with her hair pulled back, her voice steady as she described her 15-year teaching career at Desert Horizons Elementary. She testified about her commitment to helping disadvantaged students, explaining that she had offered detention during lunch and after-school tutoring specifically to provide additional support to children who were struggling academically or emotionally due to difficult home situations. Long acknowledged having closer relationships with certain students, but characterized these as appropriate mentoring connections, suggesting that any physical contact had been limited to normal encouraging touches like pats on the shoulder or brief side hugs. She directly denied all allegations of sexual abuse, suggesting that her actions had been misinterpreted or that the victims might have been influenced by suggestive questioning from investigators. Long's testimony included emotional moments where she described the impact of the allegations on her own family, her voice breaking as she spoke of her teenage children facing bullying and social isolation because of the charges against her. The performance, for it seemed clear to many observers that it was indeed a performance, was measured and carefully calibrated to present Long as a wronged educator whose good intentions had been catastrophically misunderstood. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably as Prosecutor Olivia Phillips approached the witness stand for cross-examination, her expression focused and determined as she prepared to dismantle Long's carefully constructed narrative. The Phoenix afternoon had brought clouds that occasionally dimmed the harsh desert sun, creating dramatic shifts in lighting that seemed to mirror the tension building in courtroom 3B. Phillips began with seemingly innocuous questions about Long's teaching philosophy and approach to student discipline, establishing a baseline before methodically leading into more challenging areas. The prosecutor then presented Long with the evidence recovered from her home safe, the collection of student souvenirs stored in individually labeled bags, asking her to explain why a teacher with appropriate boundaries would secretly keep personal items belonging to specific students. Long's explanation that these were simply sentimental mementos from children she had helped rang hollow when Phillips produced school records showing that the only students whose items were in the collection were those who matched the vulnerability profile and had spent unusual amounts of one-on-one time with her. The cross-examination continued with Phillips presenting excerpts from Long's encoded digital journal, the teacher's composure visibly cracking as she was confronted with her own words describing inappropriate feelings toward specific students. By the time Phillips presented the evidence of Long's pattern in detention assignments, the clear statistical preference for assigning detention to vulnerable children from troubled homes, the teacher's earlier confident demeanor had given way to visible distress, with her hands trembling and voice growing unsteady as her carefully constructed defense began to unravel under the weight of the evidence. The cross-examination reached its climax as Phillips directly confronted Long with the testimony from all three victims, noting the striking consistency in their accounts of how she had groomed and manipulated them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom as the prosecutor methodically walked Long through the specific details each victim had provided, details that matched evidence recovered from her home, classroom, and electronic devices. Phillips highlighted how Sofia Rivera had described a specific Disney Princess pencil case that Long had given her as a special gift before beginning to touch her inappropriately. The same pencil case later found in Long's bedroom safe, with Sofia's name and date written on the bag containing it. The prosecutor connected Mia Johnson's testimony about Long photographing her during special tutoring sessions with metadata from images recovered from the teacher's encrypted files, showing the exact dates and times that matched Mia's account. When presented with these specific correlations between victim testimony and physical evidence, Long's denials became increasingly desperate and implausible, her previous composed facade crumbling as she alternated between claiming memory lapses, suggesting evidence tampering, and attempting to portray herself as the victim of a conspiracy. The cross-examination effectively exposed the calculated nature of Long's predatory behavior and the deliberate construction of her public persona as cover for her abuse, leaving her credibility in tatters as she was finally excused from the witness stand, visibly shaken and avoiding eye contact with the jury as she returned to the defense table. The defense rested its case following Long's testimony, having failed to effectively counter the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. The closing arguments began the following morning with Prosecutor Phillips addressing the jury first, her tone measured but forceful as she summarized the state's case against Ramey Long. The Phoenix sun cast a clear, unforgiving light through the courtroom windows as Phillips methodically reviewed the evidence, the three victims with strikingly similar accounts spanning nearly a decade. The physical evidence recovered from Long's property, the digital evidence from her devices, the testimony from colleagues who had observed concerning behavior, and the consistent pattern of targeting vulnerable children from troubled homes. The prosecutor reminded the jury of the foundational clue that had broken the case open: Sofia Rivera's courage in finally disclosing the abuse after years of silence, leading to the discovery of a calculated pattern of predatory behavior that had victimized multiple children over Long's teaching career. Phillips concluded by asking the jury to deliver justice for Sofia, Mia, and Zoe, and any other children who might have suffered in silence, emphasizing that Long's position of authority as a teacher had made her crimes particularly egregious, a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in her by students, parents, and the community. The prosecutor's final words resonated through the hushed courtroom. Ramey Long exploited her power and authority over vulnerable children for her own gratification. She selected them because of their vulnerability, isolated them by manipulating school systems, abused them behind closed doors, and silenced them through manipulation and threats. The evidence is overwhelming. The time for accountability has come. Defense attorney Richard Collins delivered his closing argument with the energy of someone fighting against overwhelming odds, attempting to create reasonable doubt in the minds of at least some jurors. The desert afternoon heat seemed to mirror the intensity of his presentation, as Collins focused on attacking the investigation rather than directly addressing the substantial evidence against his client. He suggested that Detective Cooper had approached the case with a presumption of guilt, that the victim's memories might have been contaminated by suggestive questioning or media exposure, and that normal teacher-student interactions had been reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion once allegations emerged. Collins asked the jury to consider Long's previously unblemished record and the testimony of character witnesses who had described her as a dedicated educator committed to helping disadvantaged children. He argued that the prosecution had failed to present any direct physical evidence of sexual contact, relying instead on circumstantial evidence and testimony from young witnesses whose memories of events from years earlier might be unreliable. The defense attorney concluded by reminding the jury of the high standard of beyond reasonable doubt, and suggesting that the complex, emotional nature of the case made it impossible to reach that standard. Despite Collins's energetic presentation, his closing argument seemed to avoid addressing the most damning evidence: the encoded journals, the souvenirs collected from victims, the statistical pattern in detention assignments, and the striking consistency across victim testimonies spanning different time periods, focusing instead on creating an atmosphere of uncertainty rather than directly countering the prosecution's case. Prosecutor Phillips's rebuttal was concise and powerful, directly addressing the defense's attempts to create doubt without substantive counter-evidence. The late afternoon sun cast golden light through the courtroom as Phillips reminded the jury that reasonable doubt did not mean any doubt whatsoever, but doubt based on reason and common sense when considering the totality of the evidence. She methodically dismantled Collins's suggestion of memory contamination, pointing out that the victims had provided consistent accounts before having any contact with each other, and that their testimonies were corroborated by physical and digital evidence that could not be explained by suggestion or misremembered events. Phillips addressed the defense's focus on Long's reputation and previously unblemished record, reminding the jury that predators in positions of authority typically cultivate a positive public image specifically to enable and conceal their abuse, exactly the pattern demonstrated by the evidence in this case. The prosecutor concluded by returning to the foundational elements of the case: Long's deliberate targeting of vulnerable children, her calculated creation of opportunities to isolate them, the progressive nature of the abuse over time, and her exploitation of her position of authority to ensure silence. Phillips's final words to the jury were delivered with quiet intensity. Raimi Long counted on silence. She counted on her victim's vulnerability. She counted on her reputation protecting her. But what she didn't count on was Sofia Rivera finding the courage to speak the truth after years of carrying this burden alone. Don't let that courage be in vain. The evidence is clear. Justice demands a guilty verdict. Judge Victoria Henderson delivered her instructions to the jury late on the afternoon of the trial's 17th day, her voice clear and authoritative as she explained the legal standards they must apply to their deliberations. The desert sunset cast a warm glow through the courtroom windows as the judge defined the charges against Long: multiple counts of sexual conduct with a minor, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation of a minor, and child molestation, and the elements the prosecution needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt for each charge. She instructed the jury on how to evaluate witness testimony, including that of child witnesses and expert witnesses, and reminded them that the defendant's decision to testify should be evaluated by the same standards applied to any other witness. Judge Henderson emphasized that the jury must base their verdict solely on the evidence presented in court and the law as she had explained it, setting aside any personal feelings, biases, or external information they might have encountered. As the 12 jurors and 2 alternates were led to the deliberation room to begin their discussions, the judge admonished them on the confidentiality of their deliberations and the importance of considering each charge individually based on the specific evidence related to it. The courthouse fell quiet as the jury began the solemn task of determining Raimi Long's fate, with the Phoenix media assembled outside reporting that deliberations had begun in what had become one of the most closely watched trials in the city's recent history. The jury deliberated for 4 days, a period during which the Phoenix community waited anxiously for a verdict in a case that had sparked intense public discussion about child safety in educational institutions. The desert heat wave that had coincided with the trial continued unabated, with temperatures hovering near 100 degrees despite the autumn date, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere that seemed to mirror the tension surrounding the courthouse. Inside the deliberation room, the 12 jurors methodically reviewed the substantial evidence presented during the 3-week trial, examining physical evidence, rereading transcripts of key testimony, and discussing the legal standards for each of the charges against Long. Court observers noted the jury's requests for clarification on specific legal points, and they're asked to review certain exhibits again, suggesting a thorough and careful deliberation process. Outside the courthouse, supporters of the victims held daily vigils, while a smaller group of Long's supporters from her church congregation gathered to pray for what they characterized as justice for a wrongfully accused teacher. The extended deliberation period generated speculation about potential disagreements among jurors, but those familiar with complex child abuse cases noted that the multiple charges and the sensitive nature of the evidence typically required more extensive discussion than other types of criminal cases. On the morning of October 7, 2022, word spread rapidly through the courthouse that the jury had reached a verdict, sending journalists scrambling for positions and bringing spectators rushing to secure seats in the courtroom. The desert morning was unusually clear, with a brilliant blue sky and sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows as the principals assembled for the verdict announcement. Raimi Long arrived with her husband and attorney, her face pale and drawn after weeks of trial and the tension of waiting for the jury's decision. The victims and their families entered separately, guided by victim advocates to seating reserved for them, their expressions a mixture of anxiety and determination as they prepared to hear the outcome of the case that had dominated their lives for the past 8 months. Detective Ryan Cooper sat near the prosecution table, his professional demeanor masking the personal investment he had developed in seeing justice served for the children whose disclosures had driven the investigation. The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Henderson took the bench, the only sound the soft whirring of the air conditioning system. Fighting against the desert heat outside, the judge called court to order, instructing the bailiff to bring in the jury for the reading of the verdict in the case of Arizona versus Long. The atmosphere in courtroom 3B was electric with tension as the jury filed in, their expressions giving no indication of the decision they had reached after 4 days of deliberation. The Phoenix sun created dramatic angles of light and shadow through the high windows as Judge Henderson asked if they had reached a verdict on all counts, receiving confirmation from the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who worked as a university administrator. The court clerk accepted the verdict forms and handed them to the judge, who reviewed them briefly before returning them for reading. The clerk's voice resonated clearly in the hushed courtroom as she read the verdict on each of the 32 counts. Guilty. Count after count, the same verdict was announced, creating a devastating cascade of accountability for Ramey Long's years of predatory behavior. Long, who had maintained a composed facade throughout much of the trial, finally broke down as the reality of the unanimous guilty verdict on all counts registered, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as her husband placed a supportive hand on her back. At the prosecution table, Olivia Phillips maintained her professional composure, though observers noted the slight tremor in her hand as she made notes on the verdict forms, the emotional weight of victory in such a disturbing case evident despite her controlled exterior. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for November 15th, remanding Long into custody pending the sentencing hearing. As the former teacher was led from the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, the full impact of the verdict seemed to wash over all present. Justice had been served, but at the cost of acknowledging the terrible reality of what multiple children had endured at the hands of someone entrusted with their care and education. The reactions to the verdict revealed the complex emotions surrounding the case and its resolution. In the courthouse hallway immediately following the verdict, Sofia Rivera embraced her mother, both in tears as the tension of the trial process finally gave way to relief and vindication. The desert sun streamed through the hallway windows, illuminating this moment of bittersweet triumph for a young girl whose courage in breaking her silence had ultimately protected other children from a similar fate. Detective Cooper shook hands with Prosecutor Phillips, their quiet exchange acknowledging the significance of the outcome while recognizing that no verdict could fully heal the trauma experienced by the victims. Outside the courthouse, media crews broadcast live as various stakeholders offered their responses to the verdict. A spokesperson for the Desert Horizon School District read a prepared statement expressing profound regret for the institutional failures that allowed these crimes to continue unchecked, and outlining new policies being implemented to prevent similar situations in the future. Parents of current Desert Horizon students expressed mixed emotions, relief that justice had been served, anger at the school administration for missing warning signs, and anxiety about how to discuss the case with their children in age-appropriate ways. Long's church pastor spoke briefly, expressing compassion for all involved while acknowledging the jury's verdict and the need for accountability. The Phoenix community's reaction reflected the ripple effects of child sexual abuse cases, the shattered trust, the questioning of systems meant to protect children, and the difficult process of rebuilding and healing that would continue long after the legal proceedings concluded. The most powerful reactions came from the victims themselves, who chose to make a brief statement through their victim advocate rather than speaking directly to the assembled media. The afternoon Phoenix sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Maria Sanchez, who had supported the 3 young women throughout the trial process, read their collective statement. Today's verdict cannot undo what happened to us, but it means that Ramey Long cannot hurt any more children. It means that we were believed. It means that what happened wasn't our fault. We are more than victims. We are survivors who found the strength to speak the truth. We hope our experience encourages others who have been abused to come forward, and we hope it reminds everyone that children deserve to be protected and believed. This simple, dignified statement from three young people who had endured both the trauma of abuse and the challenging process of seeking justice through the legal system resonated deeply with those gathered outside the courthouse and the broader community following the case through media coverage. Their words emphasized that while the guilty verdict represented a crucial form of accountability, the true measure of justice would be in the healing process for those harmed and the prevention of similar abuse in the future. As the desert evening approached, casting the courthouse in golden light, the focus began to shift from the verdict itself to the upcoming sentencing and the longer-term implications of the case for educational institutions and child protection systems. Ramey Long's family, who had supported her throughout the trial despite the overwhelming evidence against her, reacted to the verdict with visible shock and distress. Her husband, Michael, who had attended every day of the proceedings, appeared devastated as he was escorted from the courthouse by family friends, avoiding the assembled media while shielding the couple's teenage children from cameras. The family's pastor later told reporters that they were processing this outcome with prayer and requested privacy during this unimaginably difficult time. Behind this public statement lay the complex reality faced by families of sexual offenders, particularly those whose crimes involved children, as they grappled with reconciling the person they thought they knew with the evidence of profound harm caused to vulnerable victims. The Long children, themselves minors at 15 and 17, now faced the harsh reality that their mother would likely spend the remainder of her life in prison, while also dealing with the social stigma and psychological impact of having a parent convicted of such disturbing crimes. Court-appointed therapists had been working with the Long children since their mother's arrest, helping them process the dual trauma of family separation and the revelations about her predatory behavior, a necessary support that would continue long after the media attention had faded from the case. In the weeks between the verdict and sentencing, the case continued to reverberate through the Phoenix community and beyond, sparking important discussions about child safety in educational settings and institutional responsibility for preventing abuse. The relentless desert sun seemed to expose every aspect of the case to public scrutiny as media outlets produced in-depth analyses of the systemic failures that had allowed Long's abuse to continue unchecked for nearly a decade. Educational experts pointed to the dismissed complaints from both a parent and a fellow teacher as critical, missed opportunities for intervention that might have prevented subsequent victims from being harmed. Child safety advocates used the case to highlight the importance of robust reporting systems, proper investigation protocols, and regular training for all school personnel on recognizing warning signs of potential abuse. The Arizona State Legislature announced hearings to review mandatory reporting laws and consider stronger accountability measures for administrators who fail to properly investigate concerns about staff behavior with students. Meanwhile, civil attorneys representing the victims filed notices of claim against the Desert Horizon School District, citing negligence in supervision and failure to follow mandatory reporting requirements when previous concerns about Long had been raised. The legal, policy, and cultural ripple effects of the case demonstrated how high-profile child abuse cases can serve as catalysts for systemic change, potentially protecting countless other children from similar harm in the future. On the morning of November 15, 2022, Ramey Long returned to Courtroom 3B for sentencing, the gravity of her situation evident in her diminished appearance after 6 weeks in county jail following the verdict. The desert winter had brought cooler temperatures to Phoenix, but inside the packed courtroom, the atmosphere remained heated with emotion as all parties prepared for the final act in the legal proceedings. Judge Victoria Henderson began by addressing the procedural matters, confirming that all parties had received the pre-sentencing report, noting the victim impact statements submitted to the court, and acknowledging the letters submitted on Long's behalf requesting leniency. The judge then invited victims who wished to speak to address the court before sentencing. Sofia Rivera, now 14, approached the podium with quiet determination, her voice steady, as she described the lasting impact of Long's abuse on her life, the trust issues, the nightmares, the therapy sessions, the moments of self-blame she still struggled to overcome. Mia Johnson and Zoe Martinez also spoke, each describing their own journey from victimization to survival, and emphasizing that Long's position as a trusted teacher had made her betrayal particularly devastating. Their statements, delivered with remarkable poise given their young ages and the difficult subject matter, created a powerful testament to both the harm caused by Long's actions and the resilience of those she had victimized. The courtroom fell silent as Rami Long was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, all eyes on the former teacher as she rose unsteadily to address the court. The desert sun cast harsh light through the windows, illuminating her face as she turned first toward her victims and their families. Long's voice broke as she offered what appeared to be a partial admission and apology. "I never intended to cause harm. I cared about my students too much in ways that I now understand were inappropriate and harmful. I am sorry for the pain I've caused." She then turned to her own family, tears streaming down her face as she apologized to her husband and children for the shame and disruption her actions had brought into their lives. The apology, while emotional, stopped short of fully acknowledging the deliberate and predatory nature of her behavior as established by the evidence presented at trial, a limitation that Judge Henderson would note in her sentencing comments. Defense attorney Richard Collins followed with a plea for mercy, citing Long's lack of prior criminal history, her contributions to the community before these events, and the impact of incarceration on her family, particularly her teenage children. He requested the minimum sentence possible under the statutes, arguing that Long posed no risk of reoffending, given the complete destruction of her teaching career and the public nature of her conviction. Prosecutor Olivia Phillips delivered a powerful sentencing argument focused on the calculated nature of Long's crimes and the profound harm caused to multiple victims over a period spanning nearly a decade. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom as Phillips methodically outlined the aggravating factors that justified a maximum sentence: the abuse of a position of trust and authority, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable victims, the grooming behaviors that demonstrated premeditation, and the sustained period over which the abuse occurred. She reminded the court of the evidence showing how Long had systematically identified children from troubled homes, created opportunities to isolate them through manipulation of school systems, and used a combination of special attention and subtle threats to ensure their silence. Phillips emphasized that the harm caused extended beyond the direct victims to include their families, the school community, and the broader public's trust in educational institutions. She concluded by requesting consecutive rather than concurrent sentences for the charges relating to each victim, arguing that each child's suffering deserved to be recognized individually in the sentencing structure. The prosecutor's final words resonated through the hushed courtroom. Rami Long made countless calculated decisions over many years that prioritized her desires over the well-being of children entrusted to her care. Justice requires that the consequences reflect both the deliberate nature of her actions and the profound harm she has caused to multiple young lives. Judge Victoria Henderson delivered her sentencing decision with the measured tone and clarity that had characterized her management of the entire trial, her voice resonating with authority in the silent courtroom. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the windows as she began by addressing Long directly. "Ms. Long, you were entrusted with the care and education of vulnerable children, a sacred responsibility that you systematically violated for your own gratification. The evidence presented at trial demonstrated beyond any doubt that your actions were not mistakes or boundary confusions, but calculated predatory behaviors carried out over many years." The judge methodically reviewed the aggravating factors, including Long's abuse of her position of authority, her deliberate targeting of vulnerable children less likely to report or be believed, the extended period over which the abuse occurred, and the psychological manipulation used to ensure victim silence. She acknowledged the mitigating factors raised by the defense, Long's lack of prior criminal history and the impact on her family, but noted that these were substantially outweighed by the aggravating factors and the profound harm caused to multiple victims during their formative years. The judge then pronounced sentence, 30 years for each of the 3 victims, to be served consecutively for a total of 90 years without possibility of parole, followed by lifetime registration as a sex offender in the event of release. The sentence effectively ensured that Ramey Long would spend the remainder of her life in prison, a consequence commensurate with the devastating impact her crimes had on multiple children entrusted to her care. The moment the sentence was pronounced, a visible wave of emotion swept through the courtroom, affecting different parties in profoundly different ways. Ramey Long collapsed into sobs, the reality of spending the rest of her life in prison shattering any remaining composure as sheriff's deputies moved to support her. The Phoenix evening had begun outside, the desert cooling rapidly after sunset, while inside the courtroom, Long's husband buried his face in his hands, their teenage children clinging to each other in evident distress, despite the heinous nature of their mother's crimes. At the victim's seating area, the reaction was more complex, not celebration, but a solemn recognition that justice had been served, with tears and embraces speaking to the emotional weight of the moment. Sofia Rivera and her mother held each other tightly, years of silent suffering and the challenging journey through the legal system, culminating in this moment of accountability. Detective Ryan Cooper maintained his professional demeanor, but allowed himself a brief nod of satisfaction as the sentence was announced, the culmination of an investigation that had begun with Sofia's courageous disclosure and led to the exposure of a pattern of predatory behavior spanning nearly a decade. As Long was led from the courtroom for the final time, the focus of those remaining shifted naturally to the survivors, 3 young women whose courage in breaking their silence had not only brought a predator to justice, but had potentially protected countless other children from similar harm at her hands. In the immediate aftermath of Ramey Long's sentencing, the Phoenix community began the difficult process of reckoning with how a predator had operated unchecked within one of its elementary schools for nearly a decade. The winter desert sun cast long shadows across Desert Horizons Elementary as Superintendent Robert Gallagher announced significant administrative changes during a press conference on the school grounds. Principal Douglas Warren had been removed from his position, with the district citing his failure to properly investigate previous complaints about Long's behavior as grounds for termination. The school district had also placed 2 other administrators on administrative leave pending an investigation into their potential knowledge of or involvement in dismissing concerns about Long's interactions with students. Gallagher announced the appointment of Dr. Elena Martinez, an educator with specialized training in child protection protocols, as interim principal with a mandate to rebuild trust and implement comprehensive new safety measures. The superintendent's voice carried across the school courtyard as he acknowledged the district's institutional failures. "We failed these children, we had warning signs, we had reports, and we did not act. There is no excuse for that failure, and we are committed to ensuring it never happens again in any of our schools. This public accountability, while coming too late for Long's victims, represented a necessary first step in the healing process for a school community devastated by the revelations about a teacher many had trusted and respected. The legal consequences of the case extended beyond Long's criminal conviction, as civil litigation moved forward against the Desert Horizons School District. The winter months in Phoenix brought unseasonably cool temperatures and occasional rain, as attorneys for the 3 identified victims filed detailed complaints alleging negligent supervision, failure to investigate complaints, and violations of mandatory reporting laws. The lawsuits cited specific instances when concerns about Long had been raised and dismissed, including parent Jennifer Lawson's complaint 3 years before the arrest and teacher Jennifer Adams's reported concerns 5 years prior. The civil cases focused on the systemic failures that had enabled Long's continued access to vulnerable children even after warning signs had emerged, seeking both compensation for the victims and institutional reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. The school district initially indicated it would contest the lawsuits, but as evidence of administrative failures mounted during discovery, settlement discussions began in earnest. By February 2023, the district's insurers had agreed to settlements totaling $15 million for the 3 identified victims, along with commitments to implement specific safety protocols, independent monitoring, and comprehensive training programs for all district employees. These settlements, while substantial, represented acknowledgment that no financial compensation could truly remediate the harm the victims had experienced, but could provide resources for their ongoing therapy and future educational opportunities. For the victims, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked not an ending, but a transition in their ongoing journey of healing and recovery. The Phoenix Spring brought the desert into bloom, a visual reminder of resilience and renewal that paralleled the experiences of Sophia Rivera, Mia Johnson, and Zoe Martinez as they worked to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of both abuse and the challenging legal process. Therapist Dr. Jessica Reyes, who specialized in trauma recovery for adolescent survivors of sexual abuse, worked with all 3 young women, helping them process their experiences and develop coping strategies for the ongoing effects of trauma. In a carefully anonymized interview for a professional journal, Dr. Reyes described how the public nature of the trial had created additional challenges for the victims' recovery process. These young women not only experienced the private trauma of sexual abuse by a trusted authority figure, but also had to navigate the public exposure of that experience through the criminal trial and media coverage. Part of their healing journey involves reclaiming their narratives and identities apart from being Long's victims. The therapeutic process focused on addressing the specific effects each young woman experienced: Sophia's trust issues and nightmares, Mia's self-harming behaviors, Zoe's difficulties with intimate relationships, while also helping them recognize and build upon the strength and courage they had demonstrated in coming forward and persevering through the legal proceedings. Ramey Long began serving her 90-year sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex, Perryville, the state's only women's prison, located about 25 miles west of Phoenix in the desert community of Goodyear. The stark reality of her new life contrasted dramatically with her former status as a respected educator, with the prison's concrete and chain-link perimeter a physical manifestation of the consequences of her predatory behavior. Long was placed in the maximum security section due to the nature of her crimes, with her daily routine governed by strict schedules for meals, limited recreation time, and closely supervised activities. Prison officials implemented standard protective measures used for inmates convicted of crimes against children who often face hostility from other prisoners. Long's husband Michael visited weekly during the first months of her incarceration, though their teenage children initially refused to see their mother as they struggled to reconcile their loving parent with the predator revealed during the trial. Prison psychologists reported that Long exhibited symptoms of depression and adjustment disorder common to new inmates facing long sentences, particularly those whose crimes had resulted in public notoriety and family disruption. The Department of Corrections assigned her to mandatory sex offender treatment programs, though clinicians noted her continued minimization of responsibility, a common cognitive distortion among sexual offenders that would present a significant challenge to any meaningful rehabilitation process. The Long family faced their own profound challenges in the aftermath of Ramey's conviction and sentencing, navigating the complex emotional terrain of having a spouse and parent imprisoned for sexually abusing children. The Phoenix summer brought scorching temperatures that seemed to mirror the intensity of the difficulties facing Michael Long and his children as they attempted to rebuild their lives in the shadow of Ramey's crimes. Michael, who had initially stood by his wife throughout the investigation and trial, filed for divorce 6 months after her sentencing, citing the irreparable damage to the marriage and his need to prioritize their children's well-being. The divorce proceedings revealed the family's financial devastation, with their savings depleted by legal fees, their home lost to foreclosure after Michael's income alone proved insufficient for the mortgage payments, and the civil settlements preventing any transfer of assets that might have helped stabilize their situation. The Long children, now 16 and 18, continued working with therapists to process their complex emotions, anger at their mother's betrayal, grief for the family life they had lost, guilt over occasionally missing the parent they had, love despite her crimes, and anxiety about their own identities and futures now inextricably linked to a notorious child sexual abuse case. Their therapists reported that both teenagers exhibited symptoms of trauma and complicated grief, with the elder child deferring college plans to remain close to his younger sibling during this period of family crisis. The institutional response to the Long case extended far beyond Desert Horizons Elementary, catalyzing significant policy changes throughout the Arizona educational system. The spring legislative session in Phoenix produced bipartisan support for the Student Protection Act, which strengthened mandatory reporting requirements, eliminated the statute of limitations for civil lawsuits related to child sexual abuse in educational settings, and established more robust background check systems for school employees. The legislation also mandated specific training for all school personnel on recognizing warning signs of potential sexual misconduct and created an independent review process for complaints about inappropriate teacher behavior to prevent the kind of administrative dismissal that had occurred with previous concerns about Long. The Arizona Department of Education revised its professional conduct standards for teachers, explicitly addressing appropriate boundaries with students and implementing regular review processes for educators who routinely kept students for detention or extra help. School districts across the state conducted comprehensive reviews of their supervision practices, particularly focusing on situations where adults might have one-on-one access to children. These systemic reforms, while coming too late for Long's victims, represented a significant positive legacy of the case, structural changes designed to prevent similar predatory behavior from going undetected in the future. Media coverage of the Long case evolved over time from sensationalistic reporting of the teacher-predator narrative to more nuanced explorations of the institutional failures that had enabled her crimes. The Phoenix autumn brought cooler temperatures and reflective coverage on the one-year anniversary of Long's arrest, with the Arizona Republic publishing an in-depth investigative series titled Betrayed Trust: How the System Failed Long's Victims. The 7-part series examined the missed warning signs, the dismissed complaints, and the school culture that had prioritized Long's academic results and reputation over student safety concerns. Documentary filmmaker Elena Rodriguez produced Silenced the Desert Horizons case, which featured interviews with child protection experts, former school employees, and parents from the Desert Horizons community, though notably not the victims themselves, who declined to participate to maintain their privacy. These journalistic explorations helped shift public understanding of the case from viewing it simply as the actions of one bad apple to recognizing the systemic failures that had created an environment where abuse could continue unchecked. This broader perspective proved crucial in maintaining momentum for institutional reforms long after the initial shock of the case had faded from public consciousness. Desert Horizons. Elementary itself underwent a profound transformation in the wake of the Long case, implementing what would later be recognized as a model child protection program under the leadership of Dr. Elena Martinez, who transitioned from interim to permanent principal 6 months after the sentencing. The Phoenix winter brought cool clarity to the desert as Martinez led the school community through a careful rebuilding process focused on transparency, accountability, and student safety. Physical changes to the school included renovations, eliminating isolated areas where adults could be alone with children unobserved, the installation of windows in all classroom doors, and an expanded camera system covering previously unmonitored areas of the campus. Procedural changes were even more significant, with new protocols requiring documentation of all one-on-one student-teacher interactions, regular rotation of detention supervision responsibilities, and mandatory reporting of any concerns about staff-student interactions, no matter how seemingly minor. The school implemented age-appropriate personal safety education for all students, teaching concepts like bodily autonomy, appropriate versus inappropriate touch, and the importance of telling trusted adults about concerning experiences. Parents were integrated into the safety framework through regular workshops, transparent communication about new policies, and meaningful roles on school safety committees. These comprehensive reforms transformed Desert Horizons from a cautionary tale to a template for how educational institutions could prioritize child protection while still providing effective academic instruction. For Detective Ryan Cooper, the Long case represented both a professional milestone and an emotional turning point in his career investigating crimes against children. The Desert Spring had returned, completing a full cycle since Sofia Rivera's disclosure had launched the investigation that exposed Long's decade of predatory behavior. Cooper sat in his modest office at the Phoenix Police Department's Special Victims Unit, surrounded by case files and the commendation he had received for his work on the Long investigation, reflecting on the impact of the case. In a rare interview granted to a police training publication, Cooper described how the case had reinforced his commitment to believing children's disclosures and pursuing investigations, even when allegations involved respected community figures. Long was exactly the type of predator who benefits from our societal reluctance to believe that good people can harm children. She counted on her reputation and position to shield her from scrutiny, and for nearly a decade, it worked. The detective had incorporated lessons from the Long case into training sessions he now conducted for other law enforcement agencies, emphasizing the importance of recognizing grooming behaviors, understanding delayed disclosure, and investigating complaints about authority figures with the same rigor applied to any other suspect. Cooper maintained periodic contact with Sofia Rivera and the other victims, providing updates on Long's status when requested, and serving as a reminder that their disclosures had been believed and acted upon, a crucial element in their ongoing healing process. 5 years after Ramey Long's conviction, a follow-up report assessed the lasting impact of the case on child protection in educational settings throughout Arizona and beyond. The Phoenix autumn brought milder temperatures and a sense of perspective as researchers from Arizona State University's School of Social Work published their findings on the institutional changes implemented in the wake of the Long case. The report documented significant improvements in mandatory reporting compliance, with a 42% increase in reports of suspected inappropriate behavior by school personnel across the state, leading to earlier intervention in potential abuse situations. Teacher training programs at state universities had incorporated specific coursework on professional boundaries and recognizing warning signs of predatory behavior, ensuring new educators entered the profession with greater awareness. The Student Protection Act had been strengthened through subsequent legislative sessions with expanded funding for implementation and monitoring of compliance. Perhaps most significantly, the report included anonymized updates on the 3 young women whose courage had exposed Long's crimes. All had graduated from high school, 2 were pursuing college degrees, and 1 was working with a child advocacy organization. While all continued to deal with the psychological effects of their traumatic experiences, they had also demonstrated remarkable resilience and had used their experiences to inform their life choices in ways that contributed to protecting other children from similar harm. The legacy of the Long case ultimately extended far beyond the specific individuals involved, serving as a catalyst for a fundamental re-evaluation of how educational institutions balance academic excellence with student safety. The desert winter brought clarity to Phoenix as educational policy experts gathered for a national conference on preventing educator sexual misconduct, with the Long case featured as a central case study in how predators exploit positions of authority and how systems can be redesigned to prevent such exploitation. The conference highlighted both the specific safety protocols implemented at Desert Horizons Elementary and the broader cultural shifts needed in educational institutions, moving away from automatic deference to teacher authority and towards systems that prioritize student safety reports regardless of the adult's status or reputation. Dr. Elena Martinez, still serving as principal at Desert Horizons, delivered a powerful keynote address, acknowledging the painful origins of the school's now model protection program. We cannot change what happened to those children in our care. That failure will always be part of our school's history. But we can honor them by ensuring it never happens again, not just in our school, but in any school. This commitment to lasting change represented perhaps the most meaningful legacy of a case that began with one student finding the courage to break her silence after years of suffering, leading to the exposure of a pattern of predatory behavior that had continued unchecked for nearly a decade behind the walls of a trusted educational institution. The final chapter of the Long case's impact played out in the lives of Sophia Rivera, Mia Johnson, and Zoe Martinez, 3 young women whose childhood experiences of abuse and subsequent courage in coming forward had ripple effects far beyond what they could have imagined when they first broke their silence. The Phoenix spring had returned once more, the desert in bloom with wildflowers that seemed to mirror the resilience of these survivors as they continued their individual journeys of healing and growth. They had each taken different paths. Sophia pursuing a degree in psychology with plans to work with traumatized children, Mia finding purpose through art therapy and creative expression, and Zoe channeling her experience into advocacy work supporting abuse prevention programs in schools. Though they had experienced one of the darkest aspects of human behavior through Long's exploitation of her position of authority, they had also witnessed the power of truth to create positive change, seeing how their disclosures had led to a predator being removed from access to children, institutional failures being addressed, and systems being redesigned to better protect vulnerable students in the future. Their ongoing recovery was neither simple nor linear, with each young woman continuing to work through the complex psychological effects of childhood trauma, but they had moved beyond being defined solely by what had happened to them. In finding the courage to speak about unspeakable experiences, they had reclaimed their voices and contributed to a safer world for other children, a legacy of hope emerging from the darkness of betrayed trust.